Hey everyone, and welcome back. If you clicked on this video looking for something creepy to relax to, fall asleep to, or just enjoy late at night, you're in the right place. Our goal is to reach 1,000 likes and 100 comments. So if everyone watching right now leaves a like and writes a comment, we can definitely make it happen. It really helps the channel. Now sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the stories. My name is Sam Norris, and this happened back in 2005 in Adirondack Park, way up in New York, during a late summer week when my job as a park ranger felt almost routine, at least until that thing changed everything forever. I remember starting that morning with the taste of regret still lingering in my mouth from the night before. My apartment in Lake George smelled like stale pizza and disappointment, and the weak coffee I'd brewed didn't do much to wash away either. The drive to work through the winding mountain roads usually cleared my head, but that Tuesday felt different somehow, heavier. The morning mist clung to the trees longer than usual, and even the radio seemed to crackle with more static than normal. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun had burned through most of the fog, revealing the familiar landscape that had been my workplace for 3 years. The Adirondack wilderness stretched out in every direction, 6 million acres of forest, lakes, and mountains that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. Most days I loved the solitude. Today, something about all that emptiness made my skin crawl. I'd started the day with a stale bagel from the vending machine and some watered-down coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since the Clinton administration. The bagel was hard enough to use as a hockey puck, but I forced it down anyway while reviewing my assignments for the day. Nothing out of the ordinary. Clear some brush near the popular trailhead, check on a few camping permits, maybe swing by the maintenance shed if time allowed. I spent the morning clearing brush near a trailhead not far from Cascade Campground, one of the sites that weekend warriors love to visit. The work was mindless, exactly what I needed to keep my thoughts from wandering to places they shouldn't go. Cut, drag, pile, repeat. The physical labor felt good, even with the late August heat making my ranger uniform stick to my back like a second skin. Around noon, the mosquitoes came out in force, and I regretted not wearing a long-sleeved shirt. Those Adirondack mosquitoes were legendary, big enough to carry away small children, or so the locals joked. But there was nothing funny about the way they swarmed around my neck and wrists, finding every exposed inch of skin like tiny, bloodthirsty missiles. I had a radio crackling on my belt, the kind that cut in and out and never sounded as clear as it should. The static was particularly bad that day, making every transmission sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Around 12:30, Marlon Rodriguez, my supervisor, came through with his usual gravelly voice. "Sam," he said, his words breaking up through the interference. "If you finish early, can you swing by the maintenance shed and see if we got a spare tire for the utility cart?" It was the kind of dull request I got every other day, the mundane reality of Park Service life that tourists never saw. I grunted a yes into the radio and kept working, thinking about how I'd probably spend the rest of my afternoon wrestling with a flat tire instead of enjoying the wilderness. The heat was getting to me by mid-afternoon. I'd already gone through 2 bottles of water and my shirt was soaked with sweat. The black flies had joined the mosquito party, creating a personal cloud of buzzing torment that followed me everywhere. I was considering calling it an early day when the radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't Marlon's voice that came through. It was Janet Walsh, the campground attendant at Cascade, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been working the park longer than I'd been alive. "Base, this is Janet at Cascade. We've got a situation here." The static was bad, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Janet wasn't the type to get rattled easily. "Go ahead, Janet," Marlon responded. "Got a couple of campers who didn't check out this morning. Brother and sister from Albany. They were supposed to leave by 10, but their car's still here. Site 47. I paused in my brush clearing. Late checkouts weren't uncommon. People lost track of time in the woods, decided to stay an extra day, got distracted by a good fishing spot. But something in Janet's voice suggested this was different. "Any sign of them at the site?" Marlon asked. "That's the thing," Janet replied, her voice fading in and out. "I went up to check and their tent's still up, but it looks abandoned. Food left out, gear scattered around. Doesn't look right." I found myself walking toward my truck without really thinking about it. The hackles on the back of my neck were rising, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was Janet's tone, or maybe it was just the way the shadows seemed to be falling wrong that afternoon. "Sam, you copy?" Marlon's voice cut through my thoughts. I grabbed the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. You're closest to Cascade. Can you head over and take a look? Names are Tyler and Emma Buchanan. They were supposed to be on a 2-day hike up the ridge trail." I keyed the mic. "Copy that. I'll head over now. As I drove toward Cascade Campground, I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. It was just a couple of hikers who'd probably lost track of time or decided to extend their stay. Happened all the time, nothing to get worked up about. But as I navigated the winding road toward the campground, I couldn't ignore the way the forest seemed to be pressing in around me. The trees looked denser somehow, their branches reaching across the road like gnarled fingers. And was it my imagination, or had the radio static gotten worse? By the time I pulled into the Cascade parking area, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon. The Buchanan's car was right where Janet said it would be, a blue Honda Civic with Albany plates, parked neatly between the yellow lines. Nothing obviously wrong with it, but something about the scene made me uneasy. I grabbed my gear from the truck. Flashlight, first aid kit, radio, and the flare gun that was standard issue for Rangers. The flare gun had always seemed like overkill to me. What were the chances I'd ever need to fire a signal flare in the middle of the Adirondacks? But as I clipped it to my belt that afternoon, I was glad to have it. Janet met me at the trailhead, her weathered face creased with worry. "I don't like it, Sam," she said without preamble. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've never seen a campsite abandoned like that. It's like they just vanished." "Maybe they had an emergency," I suggested. "Family situation back home, something like that." Janet shook her head. "Then why leave everything behind? Their food, their sleeping bags, their car keys were still in the tent." That stopped me cold. Car keys, sitting right on top of their sleeping bags, like they were planning to come back in a few minutes. I looked up the trail that led to Site 47. It wasn't a difficult hike, maybe a quarter-mile through mature forest, well-marked and maintained. On a clear day like this, it should have been pleasant. So why did the thought of walking up that trail make my stomach clench? "All right," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let me go take a look." Probably just a misunderstanding. But as I started up the trail, I couldn't shake Janet's words. The keys were still in the tent. What kind of emergency would make someone abandon their campsite but leave their car keys behind? The trail wound through a stand of old-growth pines, their trunks so thick that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that should have been peaceful. Instead, I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there. The crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. But the forest was silent. Too silent. As I climbed higher, that silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. Where were the squirrels chittering in the trees? Where were the woodpeckers hammering away at dead bark? Where were the dozen different bird calls that usually formed the soundtrack of the Adirondack wilderness? The only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. Site 47 was located on a small rise overlooking a valley filled with maples and birches. It was one of the more scenic spots in the campground, which was probably why the Buchanans had chosen it. As I crested the hill and the campsite came into view, I immediately understood why Janet had been so concerned. The tent was still standing, but barely. One side had partially collapsed, and the rainfly was twisted and torn. Their gear was scattered around the site like the aftermath of a small tornado. Sleeping bags dragged out of the tent, cooking equipment overturned, food containers split open and empty. But it was the silence that bothered me most. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but a deeper quiet that seemed to absorb even the sound of my own footsteps. It was like walking into a vacuum, a dead zone where normal life had simply stopped. I approached the tent cautiously, calling out as I went. "Tyler? Emma? Anyone here?" No response. Not even an echo. The tent's zipper was open, revealing the chaos inside. Sleeping bags were bunched up in the corner, and personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Clothes, toiletries, a paperback novel with its pages splayed open. And there, just as Janet had said, were the car keys sitting on top of a rumpled sleeping bag. I backed away from the tent and tried to think rationally. Maybe they'd gone for a hike and gotten lost. Maybe they'd had a fight and one of them had stormed off. Maybe they'd encountered a bear and had to abandon their campsite quickly. But none of those explanations accounted for the state of the camp. This wasn't the result of a hasty departure or a bear encounter. This looked like something had torn through the site with deliberate violence. I was about to radio Marlin when I noticed the first unusual track. It was pressed into a patch of soft earth near the collapsed tent, larger than a human footprint, but not quite the right shape for any animal I knew. The toe marks were too long, too sharp, and there were 4 of them instead of 5. I knelt down for a closer look, pulling out my phone to take pictures. The track was about 10 inches long and maybe 4 inches wide at the heel. Whatever had made it had been moving fast. The impression was deep at the toes, as if the creature had been running or leaping. As I studied the track, a cold realization settled in my stomach. This wasn't from any animal that belonged in the Adirondacks. Black bears had claws, but their paws were rounder, more like oversized dog prints. This was something else entirely. I followed the trail of disturbed earth away from the campsite, my unease growing with each step. The tracks led toward the tree line, where the dense forest would make tracking nearly impossible. But about 50 yards from the tent, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tyler's watch was lying in a small clearing. Its leather band snapped in two. The crystal was cracked, and the hands had stopped at 3:17. But it was what I found next to the watch that made me reach for my radio with trembling fingers. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to show that something violent had happened here. Dark red droplets were spattered across the leaves and pine needles, leading in a rough line toward the deeper forest. I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "Marlon, this is Sam," static answered me. I tried again. "Base, this is Sam at Cascade Site 47. I need backup up here." More static. Then Marlon's voice cut through, faint but readable. "What's your status, Sam?" "I found their campsite. It's bad, Marlon. Looks like there was some kind of struggle. I've got blood and unusual tracks. I'm going to need help with this one." "Copy that. I'll get Mark out there to assist." "What kind of tracks?" I looked back at the strange impression in the soil, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound crazy. "I'm not sure. Nothing I've seen before. Can you also contact the state police? We might need their search and rescue team." "Will do. Sam, be careful up there. Don't go following any trails alone." "Copy." But as I clicked off the radio, I realized I was already alone in a way that felt different from the usual solitude of the forest. This wasn't the comfortable isolation of wilderness work. This was the kind of alone that made you check over your shoulder every few seconds. The kind that made every shadow look like it might be hiding something with too many teeth. I decided to wait for Mark before following the blood trail any further. But as I stood there in the unnatural silence of that abandoned campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Something that didn't belong in any wildlife manual. Something that left tracks like nothing I'd ever seen. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows were getting longer. In another hour, it would be dark. And somehow, I didn't think darkness was going to make this situation any better. I settled in to wait for backup, keeping my back to a large pine tree and my eyes on the forest. But every few minutes, I found myself looking at those strange tracks again, wondering what kind of creature could have made them, and wondering if it was still out there watching me the same way I was watching the trees. Mark Hendricks arrived about 45 minutes later, huffing slightly from the quarter-mile hike up to Site 47. Mark was a good man, 10 years older than me, with a thick mustache and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of dealing with every kind of wilderness emergency the Adirondacks could throw at him. He was local, born and raised in Lake George, and he knew these woods better than most people knew their own backyards. "Jesus, Sam," he said, surveying the destroyed campsite. "What the hell happened here?" I showed him the tracks and the blood trail, watching his expression grow more troubled with each piece of evidence. Mark had seen bear attacks before, mountain lion kills, even the aftermath of a few human-related incidents that the Park Service preferred not to talk about. But I could tell from the way his jaw tightened that this was something new for him too. "That's not from any animal I know," he said, crouching next to the strange footprint. "Look at the claw marks. Too deep, too sharp. And the gait?" He pointed to the spacing between tracks. Whatever made these was moving fast, but not running, more like leaping. The blood trail led us about 100 yards into the forest before it became too faint to follow. The dense canopy blocked most of the remaining daylight, forcing us to use our flashlights even though it wasn't quite sunset. Our beams danced across the tree trunks, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that made everything look sinister. It was Mark who found Emma. She was about 50 yards off what remained of the blood trail, crumpled at the base of a massive oak tree. At first glance, she looked like she might just be sleeping, curled up on her side facing away from us. But as we got closer, the reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. "Oh God," Mark whispered, and I heard his voice crack slightly. Emma Buchanan had been a young woman, maybe early 20s, with long blonde hair that was now matted with blood and debris. She was wearing hiking boots, khaki shorts, and what had once been a blue t-shirt. The shirt was now torn to shreds, and the injuries underneath were unlike anything I'd seen in my 3 years as a ranger. The wounds weren't clean. They looked like they'd been made by something with multiple claws, something that had grabbed and twisted and torn with deliberate savagery. But what struck me most was the position of the body. Emma was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees, as if she'd been trying to make herself as small as possible when whatever happened to her happened. "We need to call this in," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "State police, coroner, the works." I nodded, though I was having trouble looking away from Emma's body. There was something about the scene that didn't make sense, something beyond the obvious tragedy. It took me a moment to realize what it was. "Mark," I said slowly, "look at the ground around her." He played his flashlight beam across the forest floor surrounding the body. The area was disturbed, leaves scattered, small branches broken, but not in the chaotic way you'd expect from a struggle. The disturbance formed a rough circle around Emma's body, as if something had been circling her. "What do you think?" I asked. Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene. "I think we're dealing with something that's not in any of our training manuals." As if to emphasize his point, a sound echoed through the forest, a low, mournful call that didn't match any animal either of us could identify. It seemed to come from several directions at once, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. We both froze, flashlights still and ears straining. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. "We need to find Tyler and get out of here," Mark said, but his voice carried none of his usual confidence. Tyler Buchanan was harder to find. We spent another 20 minutes following scattered traces of the blood trail, calling his name and getting no response except for that eerie call echoing periodically through the trees. The forest seemed to be getting darker faster than it should have, and our flashlight beams were creating more shadows than they were eliminating. We found him in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from his sister's body. Unlike Emma, Tyler hadn't died quietly. The scene was chaos. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and blood. Lots of blood. Tyler's body was sprawled across the clearing like a broken doll, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. He was a big guy, probably 6'2" and well-built, but whatever had killed him had tossed him around like he weighed nothing. But it was the wounds that made me step back and fight down the urge to vomit. They weren't just claw marks, they were systematic, deliberate, as if something had taken its time, had enjoyed what it was doing. "Jesus Christ," Mark breathed. "What kind of animal?" He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he was thinking. No animal did this. Animals killed for food, for territory, for protection. This was something else entirely. I was trying to process what I was seeing when I heard Mark's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Sam," he said, his voice tight with fear, "we're not alone." I turned to follow his gaze and felt my heart stop. About 30 yards away, at the edge of the clearing, something was watching us. In the dim light of our flashlights, it was hard to make out details. It stood upright, but not quite like a human. Too tall, too angular, with proportions that were somehow wrong. The torso was elongated, the limbs too long for the body. And the head was the worst part. It was tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, studying us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Even from a distance I could see that the face was pale, almost white, with dark hollows where the eyes should be. For a long moment, none of us moved. Not me, not Mark, and not the thing at the edge of the clearing. It was like some kind of horrible standoff, predator and prey trying to figure out each other's next move. Then it shifted its weight, and I heard the soft crunch of leaves under its feet, or what I assumed were feet. In the darkness, I couldn't make out the lower part of its body clearly. "Don't run," Mark whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Predators chase. Whatever you do, don't run." But even as he said it, I could see his hand moving slowly toward the radio on his belt. The creature seemed to notice the movement too, because its head tilted even further to the side, like a dog hearing a strange sound. That's when it made its own sound, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something that made every hair on my body stand on end. "Okay," Mark said, still speaking in that barely audible whisper. "We're going to back away slowly. Keep your flashlight on it, but don't make any sudden movements." We started to retreat, step by careful step. The creature watched us go, that unnatural head tilt never changing. For a moment I thought we might actually make it out of there without incident. Then Mark's foot caught on a fallen branch, and he stumbled. The sound of his curse and the crash of him hitting the ground seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped upright, and for the first time I got a clear look at its face. It had no face, where features should have been. There was just smooth, pale skin stretched over what looked like a skull. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just that horrible, featureless expanse of white flesh. And then it opened its mouth. The mouth appeared like a gash splitting across that blank face, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that defied anatomy. The sound that came out was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part scream, part roar, part something that I don't have words for. Mark scrambled to his feet, all thoughts of moving slowly forgotten. "Run," he shouted. We ran. Behind us I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, and it was gaining on us fast. Whatever it was, it moved through the forest like it belonged there, like every tree and rock and fallen log was just part of an obstacle course it knew by heart. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was closer than I'd expected, close enough that I could see the way its two long limbs moved with a fluid grace that was completely at odds with its appearance. It wasn't running so much as flowing through the forest, covering ground with an efficiency that no human could match. "The truck!" Mark gasped, pointing ahead to where we'd parked at the trailhead. We burst out of the forest and into the parking area, and for a moment I thought we'd made it. The truck was right there, maybe 50 yards away. Mark was already pulling out his keys, running toward the driver's side, but the creature didn't follow us out of the trees. We reached the truck and threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors and locking them as if sheet metal and glass could keep out whatever we'd just encountered. Mark started the engine with shaking hands, and we sat there for a moment, breathing hard and staring at the tree line. "Did you see its face?" I asked, when I could finally speak. "It didn't have a face," Mark replied. "That's the point." We waited another minute, but nothing emerged from the forest. The creature seemed content to stay in its domain, having driven us out of its territory. "We need to call this in," Mark said, reaching for his radio. "And tell them what? That we found 2 murder victims and got chased out by some kind of monster?" Mark looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Pure, undiluted fear. "We tell them the truth," he said, "and hope they believe us." But as we drove back toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was something nobody would want to believe. The thing we'd encountered in the forest wasn't supposed to exist, wasn't part of the natural world that park rangers were trained to deal with, and somehow, I knew we were going to see it again. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of police interviews, incident reports, and increasingly uncomfortable questions about what exactly Mark and I had encountered in the forest. State Trooper Detective Linda Vasquez was handling the case, and she had the kind of sharp analytical mind that didn't leave much room for unexplained phenomena. "Let me get this straight," she said, reviewing her notes in the cramped conference room at the park headquarters. "You found 2 bodies that appear to have been killed by an unknown animal, and then you were chased away by something you can't identify." "That's correct," Mark replied. He'd aged 10 years overnight, his face gray with exhaustion and stress. "And this unknown animal, you're telling me it stood upright? Like a person?" "Not like a person," I said. "The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, and the face," I trailed off, not sure how to explain what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. Detective Vasquez looked at us both with the kind of expression that suggested she thought we were either lying or having some kind of shared psychotic break. I couldn't blame her. In her shoes, I probably would have thought the same thing. "Look," she said finally, "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've seen what bears can do to people, what mountain lions can do. I've seen the aftermath of dog attacks, domestic disputes gone wrong, even a few genuine accidents that look like something out of a horror movie. But what you're describing," she shook her head, "it doesn't exist." "Then explain the bodies," Mark said quietly. That was the problem, of course. The medical examiner had taken one look at Tyler and Emma Buchanan and immediately called for backup. The wounds were unlike anything in his experience. Too systematic to be from a wild animal, too savage to be from a human attacker. The working theory was that we were dealing with some kind of exotic animal, possibly an escaped exotic pet or something released illegally into the wild. But that theory had problems too. The tracks we'd found didn't match anything in the databases. The behavior described by witnesses, if you could call Mark and me witnesses, didn't fit any known predator patterns. And then there was the question of how something that large could have survived in the Adirondack ecosystem without being spotted before now. "We're organizing a search team," Detective Vasquez told us. "State police, park service, a few local hunters who know the area. We're going to find this thing, whatever it is, and put an end to it before anyone else gets hurt." "I want to be part of the search," I said. The detective studied me carefully. "You sure about that? After what you've been through?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure about anything anymore. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stay as far away from those woods as possible. But another part, the part that had become a park ranger because I loved the wilderness, Couldn't stand the thought of that thing being out there, hunting. All right, she said. But you're going in with a full team. Nobody goes into those woods alone. The search began at dawn the next day. We had 12 people total, 4 state troopers, 3 Park Service personnel including Mark and me, 3 local hunters who knew the terrain, and 2 state wildlife biologists who specialized in large predators. Everyone was armed, everyone had radios, and everyone had been briefed on what we might be facing. The problem was, nobody really knew what we might be facing. We started at the Buchanan campsite and worked outward in a grid pattern, staying in visual contact with each other at all times. The forest was eerily quiet, just like it had been the day before. No bird calls, no small animal sounds, just the crunch of our boots on the pine needles and the occasional crackle of radio static. It was Jim Morrison, one of the local hunters, who found the first new sign. Jim was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been hunting these woods since he was a teenager. If anyone could track an unknown predator, it was him. "Got something here," he called out, crouching next to a fallen log about a half-mile from the original crime scene. We gathered around as he pointed out marks in the soft earth. The same strange 4-toed tracks we'd found at the campsite, but these were fresher, much fresher. "These are from last night," Jim said, studying the impressions. "Maybe even this morning, so it's still in the area," Detective Vasquez said. "Not just in the area," Jim replied, following the trail with his eyes. "It's been moving around, a lot. See how the tracks overlap? This thing's been pacing, like it's agitated or hunting." The trail led us deeper into the forest, through terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. Fallen trees created natural barriers, and thick underbrush forced us to move in single file. The tracks were easier to follow now. Whatever we were pursuing had stopped trying to hide its presence. We'd been following the trail for about an hour when Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the wildlife biologists, stopped abruptly. "Listen," she said. We all froze, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing except the usual forest sounds, wind in the trees, the distant call of a crow. But then I caught it. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing but deeper, more resonant. "What is that?" one of the troopers asked. "I don't know," Dr. Chen replied. "But it's big." The sound seemed to be coming from ahead of us, somewhere in the dense thicket of pines and maples that clogged the valley floor. Jim motioned for us to spread out, keeping the creature surrounded while staying within sight of each other. We crept forward, weapons ready, trying to make as little noise as possible. The breathing sound grew louder as we approached, and with it came that same organic stench Mark and I had noticed the night before. Rotting meat mixed with something else, something that reminded me of wet fur and musk. It was Mark who saw it first. "There," he whispered, pointing to a gap between 2 large pine trees. The creature was about 40 yards away, partially hidden in the shadows. It was lying down, curled up like a sleeping animal, but even at rest it was obviously massive. I could see the pale skin, the elongated limbs, the unnatural proportions that had made my skin crawl the night before. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light under the canopy, I could make out at least 2 other shapes nearby. They were smaller than the first creature, but clearly the same species. All 3 of them seemed to be resting, their breathing creating that rhythmic sound we'd been hearing. "Jesus," Detective Vasquez breathed. "How many of them are there?" Before anyone could answer, one of the smaller creatures raised its head and looked directly at us. Even from 40 yards away, I could see the moment it registered our presence. The head tilted in that unnatural way, and I knew it was trying to figure out what we were. "Nobody move," Jim whispered. "Maybe it won't." The creature let out a sound that cut through the forest like a chainsaw through silk. Not the mournful call we'd heard the night before, but something sharper, more urgent. An alarm call. All 3 creatures were on their feet instantly, moving with that fluid grace that defied their size. The largest one, the one Mark and I had encountered the night before, stood up to its full height. And I realized with sick certainty that we were looking at something that had no business existing in the natural world. It was at least 8 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso and skin that was the color of old bone. Its head was elongated, skull-like, and when it opened its mouth to make that horrible sound again, I could see rows of teeth that belonged in a nightmare. "Fall back," Detective Vasquez ordered. "Everyone fall back now." But the creatures weren't going to let us retreat that easily. The largest one moved first, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. It didn't run so much as flow through the forest, using trees and rocks as launching points to propel itself forward. Behind it, the 2 smaller creatures flanked out to either side, trying to surround us. "Open fire," Detective Vasquez shouted. The forest erupted in gunfire. I drew my sidearm and started shooting, though I had no idea if bullets would even affect these things. Around me, the other searchers were doing the same, filling the air with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of shotguns. I saw at least 2 of my shots hit the largest creature's center mass, but it barely seemed to notice. Dark liquid, not quite blood but something similar, splattered from the wounds, but the thing kept coming. Then it was among us. The creature slammed into Trooper Williams like a freight train, sending him flying into a tree trunk with a sickening crunch. Before anyone could react, it had pivoted and was reaching for Dr. Chen with those impossibly long arms. I put 3 more rounds into its torso, and this time it seemed to feel them. The thing stumbled slightly, that horrible head turning in my direction. For a split second, we made eye contact, though I'm not sure it had eyes in any conventional sense, and I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. Intelligence. This wasn't just some wild animal acting on instinct. It was thinking, planning, deciding what to do next. What it decided was to come after me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing, its breathing harsh and rapid in the thin mountain air. But there were other sounds too. Screams, more gunfire, the unmistakable sounds of a battle that we were losing. I made it about 100 yards before something slammed into my back, sending me tumbling down a steep slope covered in loose rocks and pine needles. I hit the bottom hard, my left shoulder taking most of the impact. Pain shot through my arm, but I managed to keep hold of my gun. The creature landed at the top of the slope with that unnatural grace, looking down at me like a cat studying a wounded mouse. This close, I could see details that my mind didn't want to process. The way its skin seemed to shift and move slightly, as if something was crawling underneath it. The way its limbs bent at joints that weren't quite in the right places. The way that horrible blank face somehow managed to convey emotion despite having no features. It was enjoying this. The thing started down the slope toward me, moving carefully now, taking its time. I raised my gun and fired, putting 2 rounds center mass. Dark liquid splattered, and the creature staggered slightly, but it kept coming. I fired again, aiming for what I hoped was its head. The bullet took off a piece of that pale skin, revealing something underneath that I really didn't want to see. The creature made a sound that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely, but it kept coming. I had 2 rounds left. At this range I couldn't miss, but I was beginning to doubt whether conventional weapons could stop this thing. I was trying to decide whether to aim for the head again or try for something that might be a vital organ when I heard a new sound echoing through the forest. Sirens. Lots of them, getting closer. The creature heard them too. Its head snapped up, turning toward the sound with that unnatural flexibility. For a moment it seemed to be considering its options. Finish me off or flee from the approaching reinforcements. It chose to flee. The thing turned and bounded up the slope with impossible speed, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I lay at the bottom of the slope, bleeding from a dozen scrapes and bruises, listening to the sirens getting closer and wondering how many of my fellow searchers were still alive. As it turned out, we'd been lucky. Trooper Williams had a concussion and 3 broken ribs, but he'd live. Dr. Chen had claw marks across her back that would require stitches, but nothing life-threatening. The other Dr. Sarah Chen had twisted her ankle badly but was otherwise unharmed. We'd lost Jim Morrison. They found his body about 50 yards from where the main confrontation had taken place. Like Tyler and Emma Buchanan, he'd been torn apart with systematic precision. But there was something different about Jim's wounds, something that made Detective Vasquez look sick when she saw them. They were cauterized, burned closed, as if the creature had some way of sealing the wounds it inflicted, as if it wanted to keep its victims alive as long as possible. What the hell are we dealing with? Detective Vasquez asked me as the EMTs loaded Jim's body into the ambulance. I looked back at the forest, where something that shouldn't exist was still out there, still hunting. I don't know, I said, but I don't think bullets are going to stop it. That night, I couldn't go home. Detective Vasquez had told all the survivors to get some rest, maybe see a doctor about our various injuries, and report back in the morning for debriefing. But the thought of going back to my empty apartment in Lake George, of lying in bed staring at the ceiling while that thing was still out there, was more than I could handle. Instead, I drove to the remote ranger station at Pine Ridge, a small wooden cabin about 5 miles from where we'd encountered the creatures. It was officially closed for the season, but I had keys to all the Park Service buildings, and I needed somewhere to think, somewhere I could process what I'd seen without having to explain it to anyone else. The Pine Ridge station was basic, just one room with a desk, a radio, a small kitchen area, and a cot for rangers who had to stay overnight during emergencies. It was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with a small parking area and access road on the 4th. Not exactly the kind of place you'd want to hole up if you were trying to avoid forest-dwelling monsters, but it was better than being alone in town. I parked my truck close to the front door and went inside, flicking on the lights and checking the radio. The batteries were low, but it was functional. I tried to raise Marlin at the main headquarters, but got nothing but static. Not unusual for this location. The mountains played hell with radio signals, especially at night. I made myself a cup of coffee from the supplies I found in the kitchen and sat down at the desk to try to make sense of what was happening. 3 people were dead, killed by something that shouldn't exist. We'd engaged it with trained law enforcement officers and military-grade weapons, and it had barely slowed down, and there were at least 3 of them, maybe more. I was still trying to process the implications when I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just a soft scratching noise that could have been a branch rubbing against the building in the wind. But there was no wind that night, and the sound had a rhythm to it, a deliberate quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned off the lights and moved to one of the small windows peering out into the darkness. The security light in the parking area cast a pale circle of illumination, but beyond that, everything was black. I could make out the shapes of trees at the edge of the clearing, but nothing moved. The scratching came again, this time from the back of the building. I drew my sidearm. I'd reloaded after the afternoon's encounter, and moved to the rear window. The view was blocked by a storage shed about 20 feet away, but I could see the edge of the forest beyond it. Something was moving in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible against the darker background of the forest. But as I watched, it became more distinct. Tall, pale, moving with that unnatural grace I'd come to recognize. It was testing the perimeter, staying just inside the tree line, watching the building. I backed away from the window and reached for the radio, trying to raise anyone who might be listening. "This is Ranger Norris at Pine Ridge Station," I whispered into the microphone. "I have eyes on one of the suspects. Request immediate backup." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Sam Norris at Pine Ridge. I need immediate assistance." Nothing. Either the radio wasn't working or no one was monitoring the emergency frequencies. Either way, I was on my own. The scratching sound moved to the front of the building, and I realized with growing terror that the creature was circling the cabin, testing for weaknesses. I'd been in the Park Service long enough to know that these buildings weren't designed to keep out determined predators. The windows were single-pane glass, the doors were solid wood but not reinforced, and the walls were just standard frame construction. If that thing wanted to get inside, it could. I turned off the desk lamp and moved through the cabin in darkness, checking the doors and windows. The front door had a deadbolt, which I engaged, and there was a back door that led to a small storage area. I pushed a filing cabinet in front of the back door and did the same with the desk at the front entrance. It wasn't much, but it might buy me a few seconds if the creature decided to make a move. The scratching stopped, and for a moment the silence was even worse than the sound had been. I stood in the center of the cabin, gun drawn, trying to listen for any indication of where the thing had gone. Then I heard breathing. It was coming from right outside the front window, maybe 3 feet away from where I was standing. Deep, rhythmic breathing, like something large and patient waiting for the right moment to strike. I moved away from the window as quietly as possible, but the floorboards creaked under my weight. The breathing stopped instantly, and I knew the creature had heard me. For several long minutes, nothing happened. I stood in the darkness, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or splintering wood. But the creature seemed content to wait, to let the fear build. Then I heard a new sound. A soft tapping on the glass of the front window. Tap, tap, tap. It was almost gentle, like someone politely asking to be let in. But there was something about the rhythm that made my skin crawl. It was too regular, too patient, like a predator that knew it had all the time in the world. The tapping moved to the side window, then to the back. The creature was making its way around the building again, but this time it was announcing its presence, letting me know that it knew exactly where I was. I tried the radio again, but got nothing except static. The landline phone was dead too, not unusual for this remote location, but frustrating as hell under the circumstances. The tapping stopped, and once again the silence stretched out like a living thing. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sound that might give away the creature's location. That's when I heard the footsteps on the roof. They were heavy, deliberate, moving from one end of the building to the other. The creature had climbed up onto the cabin, and now it was testing the structural integrity of the roof. I looked up at the ceiling, watching for any sign that the boards might give way under its weight. A small shower of dust fell from the rafters as the footsteps moved directly overhead. The creature was big. I'd seen that during our encounter in the forest, but I had no idea it was heavy enough to make the entire building shake. The footsteps stopped, directly above where I was standing. I could hear the creature settling into position, as if it was making itself comfortable. Then, silence. I waited. Minutes passed. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, waiting. I was still trying to figure out what it was planning when I heard a new sound. A soft, almost conversational noise that seemed to be coming from the creature's throat. It wasn't the horrible scream I'd heard in the forest, or the mournful call that had echoed through the trees. This was different, quieter, almost like it was talking to itself, or to me. The sound continued for several minutes, rising and falling in pitch like some kind of alien language. I found myself listening despite my terror, trying to make sense of the patterns. Was it trying to communicate? Was it taunting me? Or was it just the sound a predator made when it was content, when it knew its prey was trapped? Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the back of the building. I heard a new sound, the screech of metal being bent or torn. The creature was doing something to the roof, but I couldn't tell what. A few minutes later, I found out. Water started dripping from the ceiling in the back corner of the cabin. Just a few drops at first, but then more, faster. The creature had torn a hole in the roof, and now the night air was coming in. But it wasn't just air. Along with the cool mountain breeze came that smell, the organic, rotting stench that seemed to follow the creatures everywhere. And with the smell came something else, the sound of breathing, much closer now, coming from directly above the hole in the roof. The creature was trying to get inside. I moved to the front of the cabin, as far from the damaged roof as possible, and tried to think of a plan. The radio was useless, the phone was dead, and my truck keys were in my pocket, but the truck was parked right outside the front door, where the creature would see me the moment I stepped outside. I was trapped. And the thing knew it. The hole in the roof was getting bigger. I could hear the creature working at it, tearing away boards and roofing material with what sounded like its bare hands, or claws, or whatever passed for appendages on that nightmare anatomy. More debris fell from the ceiling, and the smell got stronger. I realized with sick certainty that the creature wasn't just trying to get inside. It was taking its time, savoring the fear, drawing out the hunt for its own amusement. That's when I remembered the flare gun. Every ranger carried one, along with emergency flares for signaling aircraft or other rescue teams. Mine was clipped to my belt, and I'd forgotten about it in the chaos of the afternoon's encounter. But now, looking up at the growing hole in the roof, I realized it might be my only chance. Flares burned at extremely high temperatures, hot enough to start fires, hot enough to cause severe burns to anything they hit. If I could get a clear shot when the creature came through the roof, the hole was almost big enough now. I could see stars through the gap, and occasionally, a shadow would pass across them as the creature moved around the opening. It was getting ready to drop down into the cabin. I positioned myself against the far wall, flare gun drawn and ready. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode, but my hands were steady. 3 years of ranger training had taught me to stay calm in emergencies. And if this didn't qualify as an emergency, nothing did. A piece of the ceiling crashed down onto the floor, followed by more debris. The hole was definitely big enough now for something to come through. I raised the flare gun, aiming at the opening, and waited. The breathing sounds from above got louder, closer. I could see something pale moving in the darkness beyond the hole, part of an arm maybe, or a leg. The creature was positioning itself to drop down. Then, suddenly, it pulled back. I heard rapid movement on the roof, footsteps heading toward the edge of the building. Had it changed its mind? Had it sensed the flare gun somehow? A moment later, I got my answer. The front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and wood frame. The creature had jumped down from the roof and launched itself through the window like a missile, landing in the center of the cabin in a crouch. This close, in the confined space of the cabin, it was even more terrifying than it had been in the forest. It filled the room with its presence, all pale skin and impossible angles, and that horrible eyeless face turned in my direction. I fired the flare gun. The flare hit the creature center mass and exploded in a burst of red light and burning chemicals. The thing let out a scream that made my teeth ache and staggered backward, clawing at the flare that was now burning into its torso. But it didn't go down. Instead, it turned that nightmare face toward me, and despite the lack of visible features, I could sense its rage. The flare was still burning, stuck to its chest like napalm, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature took a step toward me, then another. I grabbed my pistol and emptied the clip into it, putting all 15 rounds center mass. Dark liquid sprayed from the wounds and the creature stumbled, but it kept coming. I threw myself toward the back door, shoving aside the filing cabinet I'd used to barricade it. My shoulders screamed in protest. I'd aggravated the injury from my fall in the forest, but adrenaline carried me through. I burst out of the cabin and ran for the tree line, not caring about the darkness or the rough terrain. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the cabin, destroying everything in its path as it pursued me. I made it about 50 yards into the forest before I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I was running blind in unfamiliar terrain, with no light and no clear destination, and I was running into the creature's territory, where it had every advantage. I stopped, pressing my back against a large pine tree, and tried to listen for sounds of pursuit. The forest was quiet except for my own ragged breathing and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, that soft conversational sound the creature had made while it was on the roof. It was somewhere behind me, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, and it seemed to be moving parallel to my position rather than directly toward me. It was hurting me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just chasing me randomly, it was driving me in a specific direction, toward some predetermined destination. Maybe toward the other creatures I'd seen in the forest, maybe toward some kind of lair or feeding ground. I tried to change direction, moving perpendicular to what I thought was the creature's position, but every time I did, I heard that sound again, closer now, cutting off my escape routes. I was being hunted by something that was smarter than me, stronger than me, and perfectly adapted to this environment. And I was running out of options. That's when I saw the light. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible through the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was artificial, electric light coming from what looked like another building, a way station maybe, or a hunter's cabin. I changed course, heading toward the light, hoping against hope that it represented safety. Behind me, the creature's vocalizations became more agitated, as if it realized its prey was about to escape. I burst out of the forest and into a small clearing where a hunting cabin sat next to a narrow dirt road. Lights were on inside, and I could see a pickup truck parked next to the building. Someone was home. I ran toward the cabin, shouting for help, when the front door opened and a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, wearing hunting clothes, and he had a rifle in his hands. "What the hell?" he started to say, then stopped as he saw me. "There's something in the forest," I gasped, stumbling toward him. "Something dangerous. We need to call for help." The man looked past me toward the tree line, and his expression changed. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What is that thing?" I turned to follow his gaze and saw the creature standing at the edge of the clearing just inside the forest. It was completely motionless, watching us with that terrible, eyeless face. The flare was still burning on its chest, casting flickering shadows across its pale skin. "Get inside," the man said, raising his rifle. Now, we backed toward the cabin, keeping our eyes on the creature. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us retreat, as if it was calculating its next move. We made it inside the cabin, and the man, who introduced himself as Bill Hartman, helped me barricade the door. He had a landline phone, and within minutes we'd contacted the state police and requested immediate backup. "How long until they get here?" I asked. Bill looked out the window toward the forest. The creature was gone, but we both knew it was still out there. 20 minutes, he said. Maybe 30. I looked at my watch. It was just past midnight. We had to hold out until help arrived, and I had no idea if that was possible. Outside, something began to circle the cabin, and I realized the nightmare was just beginning. The siege lasted until dawn. For the next 5 hours, Bill and I huddled in that hunting cabin while the creature, and at least 2 others that had joined it, systematically tested every possible way to get inside. They tried the windows, the doors, even the chimney. They climbed onto the roof and tried to tear it apart the same way the first one had done at the ranger station. When that didn't work, they tried psychological warfare. The sounds they made still haunt me. Sometimes it was that conversational murmuring, as if they were discussing strategy. Sometimes it was mimicry, perfect imitations of human voices calling for help, pleading to be let inside. Once I swear I heard one of them say my name in a voice that sounded exactly like my sister's, even though she lived 3,000 miles away in Oregon. "Don't listen to it," Bill warned me when I started to move toward the window. "Whatever you do, don't listen." Bill had encountered the creatures before, it turned out. Not face to face like Mark and I had, but he'd found evidence of their presence over the past few months. Tracks that didn't match any known animal. Prey animals that had been killed and partially eaten, but left in ways that suggested ritual rather than simple predation. Strange sounds echoing through the forest at night. I thought I was going crazy, he told me as we waited for dawn. Started wondering if I'd been in the woods too long, seeing things that weren't there, but they were there. And now they were outside his cabin, trying to get in. The first police units arrived around 3 a.m., but the creatures had vanished back into the forest long before the officers could get into position. By the time Detective Vasquez showed up with a full tactical team, there was nothing to see but disturbed earth around the cabin, and a few more of those impossible footprints. "Are you hurt?" she asked me as I stumbled out of the cabin. I was scraped up from my run through the forest, my shoulder was throbbing from where I'd hit the slope, and I hadn't slept in 36 hours. But I was alive, which was more than I'd expected a few hours earlier. "I'm okay," I said. "But we need to do something about these things. They're not going away." Detective Vasquez nodded grimly. "We've got the National Guard on standby, and there's a team from the CDC flying in this afternoon. Whatever these things are, we're going to figure out how to stop them." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. How do you fight something that bullets barely slow down? How do you track something that can disappear into the forest like smoke? How do you kill something that might not even be alive in any conventional sense? The CDC team arrived that afternoon led by Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in exotic diseases and unknown pathogens. He took tissue samples from the dark liquid we'd found at various encounter sites, interviewed all the survivors, and spent hours studying the footprint casts that had been made. His conclusion was both fascinating and terrifying. Based on the tissue analysis he told us in a briefing that evening, we're dealing with something that's partially organic and partially something else. The cellular structure is unlike anything in our databases. It's as if someone took human DNA and mixed it with something that shouldn't exist. "Are you saying these things are artificial?" Detective Vasquez asked. "I'm saying they're not entirely natural," Dr. Webb replied carefully. "Whether they're the result of genetic experimentation, environmental contamination, or something else entirely, I can't determine from the samples we have. What we did determine was that the creatures were incredibly resilient. The tissue samples continued to show signs of activity even after being removed from the source, and when Dr. Webb tried to destroy a sample with extreme heat, it seemed to regenerate itself. "We're going to need a different approach," he said. That different approach came in the form of fire. The decision to burn them out was controversial, but after another night of attacks, this time targeting a family camping near Lake George, the authorities decided they had no choice. A controlled burn was the only way to flush the creatures out of the forest and into areas where they could be contained and studied. I volunteered to be part of the operation. After everything I'd been through, I needed to see this finished. I needed to know that these things wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. The burn was scheduled for the following morning. Firefighting teams would create fire breaks around a large section of forest where the creatures had been most active, then systematically burn inward toward the center. The theory was that the creatures would be forced to flee to the one remaining exit, where heavily armed teams would be waiting. It was a good plan, it should have worked, but we underestimated just how intelligent these things were. The burn started at dawn, with teams working from multiple directions to create a contracting circle of fire. I was with the eastern team, watching the flames spread through the underbrush and up into the lower branches of the pine trees. The fire was controlled, professional, designed to clear undergrowth without destroying the entire forest. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. The creatures seemed to be staying ahead of the flames, moving toward the center of the burn area as expected. We had thermal imaging drones tracking their movement, and the plan seemed to be working. Then, around noon, the creatures changed tactics. Instead of continuing to flee from the fire, they started moving toward it. The thermal imaging showed them approaching the fire breaks from multiple directions as if they were coordinating an attack on the firefighting teams. "All units, be advised," came the radio call from the command post. "Subjects are changing direction. They're coming toward your positions." I was with a team of 6 firefighters and 3 state troopers, working a fire break about a quarter mile from the main blaze. We'd been watching for creatures fleeing the fire, not attacking from it. The first one came out of the smoke like something from hell itself. It was one of the larger ones, covered in soot and moving with that terrifying fluid grace despite the fact that parts of its pale skin were obviously burned. It emerged from the flames and launched itself at the nearest firefighter before any of us could react. The firefighter, a man named Rodriguez who'd been doing this job for 15 years, went down screaming. The creature landed on top of him and began tearing at his protective gear with those impossible claws. The rest of us opened fire, but the creature seemed to be energized by the flames rather than weakened by them. It turned from Rodriguez's body and came toward us, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. That's when I realized the truth about these creatures. They weren't just resistant to fire, they were powered by it. The flames that should have driven them away or killed them were instead making them stronger, faster, more aggressive. "Fall back," I shouted, but it was too late. Two more creatures emerged from the burning forest, and suddenly we were surrounded. The tactical situation had gone from a controlled burn to a fighting retreat in a matter of seconds. I found myself back to back with Trooper Martinez, firing at anything that moved while trying to reach the vehicles we'd parked at the road. Around us, the other members of our team were fighting for their lives against creatures that seemed to grow more powerful with each passing minute. "We need to get out of here," Martinez yelled over the sound of gunfire and screaming. I couldn't have agreed more. We started moving toward the road, laying down covering fire, but the creatures were hurting us again. Every time we tried to break toward the vehicles, one of them would appear to cut us off. They were playing with us, just like they had with me at the ranger station. They were drawing out the hunt for their own amusement. That's when the explosion happened. I never found out exactly what caused it, whether it was a fuel tank from one of the firefighting vehicles, or a propane canister, or something else entirely. But the blast was enormous, sending a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. The creature's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Instead of being driven away by the explosion, they seemed drawn to it. All three of them turned toward the fireball and began moving in that direction, their attention completely diverted from us. Martinez and I didn't waste the opportunity. We ran for the road, covered the distance to our vehicle in record time, and got the hell out of there. The controlled burn was called off within an hour. Too many casualties, too many variables, too much evidence that our enemy was smarter and more adaptable than we'd given it credit for. But something else happened that day, something that changed everything. Dr. Webb, monitoring the situation from the command post, noticed something in the thermal imaging data. The creature's body temperatures had spiked dramatically during the fire, reaching levels that should have been fatal to any living organism. But instead of dying, they had seemed to feed off the heat, growing stronger and more active. "I think I know what they are," he told Detective Vasquez and me that evening. Or at least, what they might have been. He pulled up files on his laptop, showing us research from the 1950s and 60s. Classified government experiments that had been declassified decades later. Project Wendigo, he said. A joint military scientific program designed to create enhanced soldiers who could survive in extreme environments. The project was officially terminated in 1963 after a series of accidents, but the research was never fully destroyed. "Are you saying these things are escaped government experiments?" Detective Vasquez asked. "I'm saying they might be the descendants of escaped experiments," Dr. Webb replied, "or the result of someone attempting to recreate the original research." The implications were staggering. If these creatures were the result of human experimentation, then there might be records of how they were created. And if they were created, there might be a way to destroy them. But that was a problem for another day. For now, we had more immediate concerns. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, and the fire had only made them stronger. As I drove home that night, exhausted and covered in soot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting a war we didn't understand against an enemy we couldn't defeat. The creatures had outsmarted us at every turn, adapted to every strategy we'd tried, and somewhere in the burned forest, they were waiting for us to try again. I never did find out the full truth about what those creatures were or where they came from. The investigation was taken over by federal authorities a few days later, and people like me, local rangers and small-town cops, were told to stay out of it for our own safety. But I kept working in the Adirondacks for another 2 years, and I never stopped listening for that sound in the forest. The mournful call that meant something impossible was watching from the shadows. I heard it a few more times, always distant, always just on the edge of perception, but I never saw the creatures again. Maybe the federal authorities found a way to deal with them. Maybe they moved on to other hunting grounds, or maybe they just learned to be more careful about being seen. I left the Park Service in 2007 and moved to Arizona, where the desert doesn't have enough trees to hide things that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still think I can hear that sound, a call from something that was once human, or almost human, echoing across the darkness. And I wonder if Tyler and Emma Buchanan, Jim Morrison and Rodriguez the firefighter were the only ones who paid the price for humanity's hubris. Or if somewhere, in forests across the country, other creatures are waiting in the shadows. Patient and intelligent and hungry. The official report listed the incidents as animal attacks by an unknown predator. The case was closed, the files were sealed, and life in the Adirondacks went back to normal. Tourists still come to camp and hike and enjoy the wilderness. Rangers still patrol the trails and help lost hikers. But we know the truth. Some of us anyway. We know that the forest holds secrets darker than most people can imagine. And we know that sometimes, when you go deep enough into the wild places, you might find things that were never meant to exist. I still smell that campsite when I close my eyes. I still see those twisted limbs and that pale, eyeless face watching from the tree line. And I still wake up sometimes, in my apartment in Phoenix, thinking I can hear something breathing just outside my window. The park went on as usual, with new visitors and smiling photos in the brochures. But at night, alone in my apartment, I remember those creatures, and I know something impossible walked those woods. Something that might still be walking them today. I managed to survive those few days in 2005, but I'm not sure I'll ever really escape them. The memory keeps haunting me, and sometimes I wonder if that's not exactly what those things wanted. For the survivors to carry the fear forward, to spread the story, to keep the legend alive, because that's what they were, in the end. Modern legends, born from humanity's darkest impulses and set loose in the world to hunt and kill and watch from the shadows. And legends, as any park ranger will tell you, have a way of persisting long after the truth has been forgotten. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue the moment I understood what we were truly hunting in those woods. Blood had already begun to seep across the pine needles, and I had no idea I'd soon come face to face with something so cunning and vicious, nor that I'd be forced to reveal everything I've kept hidden for years. Now I'm ready to share the truth, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. If you stay with me, I'll show you a side of the wild few dare to imagine. But brace yourself, because it's never gentle. My name is Marcus Bennett, and this nightmare began back in 2012 in the Cascade National Forest in Washington State. I'd been working search and rescue for nearly 8 years, but I always felt that distinct adrenaline surge every time a call came in. That gray October morning, dispatch crackled through with news about 2 missing hikers who had set out on a remote backcountry trail and failed to return to their planned pickup point. I climbed into the department's truck with my partner, Detective Ray Sullivan. Ray was the kind of guy who could find humor in a funeral. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a repertoire of terrible dad jokes that somehow managed to cut through the tension on our worst days. We'd worked together for 3 years, and his steady presence had pulled me through more than one difficult recovery. The Forest Service had been dealing with an unusual number of strange disappearances in the area, echoing patterns that researchers like David Paulides had documented across the country. But that morning we assumed this would be routine. Maybe some city folks who'd wandered off trail or gotten caught in the early snow that had dusted the higher elevations overnight. We loaded our gear, first aid kits, climbing rope, emergency beacons, flares, and enough water for a 2-day search if necessary. Ray tossed in a thermos of coffee and a bag of his wife's homemade cookies, grinning as he caught my raised eyebrow. What? A man's gotta eat, even when he's saving lives. The trailhead sat beneath towering Douglas firs, their trunks disappearing into a gray mist that clung to the canopy like cobwebs. The air carried that sharp, clean scent of approaching winter, pine resin mixed with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. An old ranger named Tom Bradley met us by his weathered pickup truck, his face grim beneath a battered baseball cap. Tom had been patrolling these mountains for over 20 years. He was the sort of ranger who knew every hidden ravine, every animal trail, every place where a person might take shelter or meet trouble. His weathered hands gestured toward a hand-drawn map as he briefed us on the missing hikers. Names Jessica Chen and Michael Torres, Tom said, his voice gravelly from years of calling across valleys. Young couple from Seattle. Planned a 3-day backpacking trip along the North Ridge Trail, supposed to loop back to Timber Creek Campground. Their buddy was going to pick them up yesterday evening. Never showed. Tom's expression darkened as he pointed to several red X's marked on his map. Here's the thing that's got me worried. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of them anywhere along the main routes. Not a single other hiker, not the weekend campers at Maple Falls, nobody at the ranger stations. It's like they vanished the minute they left the parking lot. Ray whistled low. Maybe they decided to go off script, take some unmarked trail? Maybe, Tom said. But he didn't sound convinced. Or maybe they ran into something they couldn't handle. Weather's been weird up there, fog rolling in at strange times, temperature drops that don't match the forecast, and, He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. And what? I prompted. Other hikers have been reporting some odd things. Sounds that don't belong. Tracks that don't match any known wildlife. Hell, last week a group of climbers swore they saw someone or something moving through the trees way up on the ridgeline, but when they got there with binoculars, nothing. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Ray clapped Tom on the shoulder. Well, we'll keep our eyes open for Bigfoot. Come on, Marcus. Let's go find these kids before they freeze their asses off. We started up the steep trail, our boots crunching through a thin layer of frost-covered leaves. The forest felt unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, just the soft whisper of wind through the branches and our own breathing, visible in small puffs of vapor. For the first hour, we maintained radio contact with dispatch, calling in our position every 15 minutes. We checked every obvious campsite, every stream crossing, every place someone might stop to rest or take photos. We found absolutely nothing. This is weird, Ray muttered as we paused at a trail junction. Even if they went off the beaten path, we should see some sign. Footprints in the mud, broken branches, something. I knelt beside a small creek, studying the soft earth along its banks. The only tracks I could make out belonged to deer and what looked like a family of raccoons. But there was something else. A strange depression in the mud, roughly circular and about the size of a dinner plate, but deep enough that it had filled with dark water. Ray, come look at this. He crouched beside me, frowning at the odd marking. What do you think made that? I have no idea. It's too big for any animal foot I know, but too round. And look how deep it is. Whatever left this was heavy. Ray stood and scanned the surrounding forest, his hand unconsciously drifting to the radio clipped to his shoulder. Maybe we should call Tom, get his take on this. Before I could respond, we heard it, a sound that made both of us freeze. It started as a low moan, almost like wind through a cave, but there was something distinctly unnatural about it. It rose in pitch, became more shrill, then cut off abruptly. What the hell was that? Ray whispered. The sound had come from somewhere ahead of us, deeper into the forest where the trees grew so thick that the canopy blocked out most of the gray daylight. I felt my heart rate spike as every instinct screamed at me to turn around and head back to the truck. Instead, I shouldered my pack and started forward. Could be one of the missing hikers, someone hurt, calling for help. Ray fell into step behind me, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. That didn't sound human, Marcus. Then we need to find out what it was. We pushed deeper into the forest, following what might have been a game trail or might have been our imagination. The trees seemed to press closer with each step, their branches creating a tunnel of green-black shadows that muffled our footsteps and made every sound seem both too loud and too distant. That's when we found the first piece of evidence that Jessica and Michael had actually made it this far into the wilderness. Snagged on a low branch about chest-high was a strip of bright blue fabric, the kind used in high-end hiking gear. Ray carefully worked it free and held it up to catch what little light filtered through the canopy. Looks fresh, he said. No weathering, no fading. This was left recently. I examined the branch where the fabric had been caught. The bark was scraped and gouged, as if someone had been pulled or dragged past it with considerable force. Below the branch, several smaller twigs were snapped off, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Dark stains spattered the leaves and moss at the base of the tree, not enough to indicate a serious injury, but definitely blood. Ray, he looked where I was pointing and swore under his breath. We both knew what this meant. Someone had been hurt here, and recently. Whether it was Jessica or Michael, we had no way of knowing, but it confirmed our worst fears about this search. I pulled out my radio and tried to raise Tom, but got nothing but static. The thick canopy and the strange electromagnetic properties of the Cascade Mountains often interfered with communications, but the timing felt ominous. We should head back, Ray said quietly. Get more people, better equipment, dogs maybe. I wanted to agree with him, but something held me back. If one of the missing hikers was injured and alone out here, every hour we delayed could mean the difference between life and death. The thought of Jessica or Michael lying somewhere in these dark woods, bleeding and afraid, overrode my growing sense of unease. Let's go a little further, I said, just to see if we can pick up their trail. Ray didn't look happy about it, but he nodded. We both knew the protocol. Never abandon a search when there's evidence that victims might still be alive. We followed what seemed to be a path through the undergrowth, marked by more broken branches and occasional scuff marks in the dirt. The blood trail had stopped, which could mean the injured person had bandaged their wound or other possibilities I didn't want to consider. The forest grew stranger as we ventured deeper. Trees that should have been familiar looked twisted and malformed. Moss hung from branches in ways that seemed almost deliberate, like green curtains designed to hide whatever lay beyond. Even the air felt different, thicker, with an underlying scent that reminded me of something rotting. After another 30 minutes of slow progress, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a massive Douglas fir that must have been centuries old, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter, and scattered around its base was camping gear, a blue two-person tent, collapsed and partially shredded, a portable camp stove, overturned in the dirt, sleeping bags ripped open, their synthetic fillings scattered like snow across the forest floor, and everywhere signs of a violent struggle. Gouged earth, broken tree limbs, more dark stains that could only be blood. Jesus Christ, Ray breathed. I approached the destroyed campsite carefully, scanning for any sign of what had happened here. This was definitely where Jessica and Michael had planned to spend at least one night. I found a waterlogged driver's license half buried in leaves. Michael Torres, 26, Seattle, Washington. But where were the bodies? Ray was examining the tent, his face pale. Marcus, look at this. The tears in the nylon weren't random. They formed a pattern. Long, parallel slashes that looked almost like claw marks but too large and too deliberate for any animal I knew. Whatever had destroyed this tent had known exactly what it was doing. We need to get out of here, Ray said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Right now. I was about to agree when we heard the sound again, that unnatural moan rising from somewhere in the trees around us. But this time it was answered by another call, and then another, until the forest echoed with a chorus of inhuman voices, and they were getting closer. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Our breath came in sharp puffs as we stood frozen in the destroyed campsite, listening to those impossible calls echoing through the forest around us. The sounds moved, circling us, testing us, hurting us. Move, I whispered, grabbing Ray's arm. Slowly, back the way we came, we began to retreat from the clearing, stepping carefully over fallen branches and trying not to make any sound that might attract whatever was producing those calls. But the forest had become a maze of shadows and twisted shapes, and I soon realized we were no longer following the same path that had brought us here. Ray caught my arm and leaned close to my ear. We're lost. He was right. The trees all looked the same now, massive, dark pillars stretching up into a canopy so thick it blocked out the sky. Worse, the calls had stopped, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt oppressive. We tried the radio again. Nothing but static, though I swore I could hear something else buried in the white noise. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. There, Ray whispered, pointing to a gap between two enormous firs. I think I see light. We pushed through the gap and found ourselves on what might have been another trail, though it was narrower than anything maintained by the Park Service. The path wound downhill through increasingly dense undergrowth, but Ray was right. There was definitely more light ahead, suggesting a larger clearing, or maybe the edge of the forest. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards when we found the first body. Jessica Chen lay in a hollow beside the trail, her body contorted in an impossible position. Her hiking clothes were shredded, and her face, her face was a mask of pure terror, eyes and mouth wide open as if she'd died screaming. But what made my stomach lurch was the condition of her limbs. Her arms and legs were bent at angles that defied human anatomy, twisted like a doll that had been pulled apart and reassembled by a sadistic child. There was no blood. Whatever had done this to her had been precise, surgical almost. Ray stumbled backward, his face green. What the fuck could do that to a person? I forced myself to examine the body more closely, fighting down nausea. No visible wounds, no signs of animal attack, just those impossible contortions. And her eyes, those terrified eyes, seemed to be staring at something behind us. I spun around, expecting to see some monster looming over us, but found only empty forest. Still, the feeling of being watched was so intense it made my skin crawl. We have to find Michael, I said, though my voice sounded strange and hollow in my own ears. Fuck Michael, Ray snapped. We have to get out of here before whatever did this comes back. I understood his fear. Christ, I felt it too. But I couldn't abandon the search. Not yet. Just a little further. If we don't find him in the next 10 minutes, we'll head back. Ray looked like he wanted to argue but finally nodded. We continued down the narrow trail, both of us jumping at every shadow, every whisper of wind through the branches. We found Michael Torres another 100 yards down the path, or what was left of him. Unlike Jessica, Michael had been savaged. His body was scattered across the trail in pieces that I won't describe in detail, but the wounds weren't consistent with any animal attack I'd ever seen. The tears in his flesh were too clean, too deliberate, and arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, a calculating malevolence that went far beyond simple predation. But the worst part was his head. It sat upright against a tree trunk 15 feet from the rest of his remains, and his eyes were moving, following us as we approached, blinking occasionally, lips moving as if trying to speak though no sound emerged. Ray made a choking sound and stumbled into the bushes where I could hear him violently sick. I stood transfixed by Michael's impossible, living gaze, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The lips moved more frantically, and I found myself leaning closer, trying to read what he was attempting to say. The word formed silently over and over. Run, run, run. That's when I saw it. Something moved in the shadows between the trees behind Michael's head, a pale, elongated shape that seemed to flow rather than walk. It was watching us with eyes that reflected the dim light like an animal's, but there was nothing animal about the intelligence I saw there. It reminded me of the stories I'd heard from other search and rescue officers, tales of humanoid figures with unnaturally long limbs and faces that seemed almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. This thing was tall, maybe 7 feet, with arms that hung past its knees and skin that looked like wet leather stretched over 2 prominent bones. Its face was the worst part. Almost human, but the proportions were all wrong. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a perpetual grin that showed far too many teeth. And that grin was fixed on us with predatory focus. Ray had recovered enough to rejoin me. But when he saw the thing lurking in the shadows, he went completely still. We both understood instinctively that any sudden movement would trigger an attack. The creature tilted its head with bird-like curiosity, studying us the way a scientist might examine lab specimens. When it moved, it did so with fluid grace that defied its apparent size, flowing between the trees like smoke, never taking its eyes off us. I reached slowly for the pistol on my belt, but the thing's grin widened as if it found my weapon amusing. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at us, and I heard that low moan again, not from its mouth, but seeming to emanate from the forest itself. The call was answered immediately from multiple directions. They were all around us. "Marcus," Ray whispered, his voice tight with panic. "We need to run, now." But I couldn't move. The creature's eyes had locked onto mine, and I felt something probing at the edges of my mind. Cold, alien thoughts trying to burrow into my consciousness. Images flashed through my head. Jessica and Michael's final moments, the terror and agony as they realized what was happening to them, and something else, a sense of vast hunger, ancient and patient, that had been waiting in these woods for far longer than humans had walked the earth. The mental intrusion shattered when Ray grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. "Move your ass." We ran. Behind us, the forest erupted in those inhuman calls, echoing from every direction as the things gave chase. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, moving with impossible speed through terrain that should have slowed them down. Ray was faster than me, his longer legs eating up ground as we fled down the narrow trail. But I could tell we weren't going to outrun them, not in their own territory, not when they knew every tree and stone. "This way," Ray shouted, veering off the trail toward what looked like denser forest. I followed without question, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. We burst through a screen of hanging moss and found ourselves on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could see the silver glint of running water. Behind us, the calls were getting closer. "Can you make that jump?" Ray asked, pointing to a fallen log that bridged the ravine about 20 feet to our left. I looked at the rotting trunk, easily 40 feet long and slick with moss, spanning a drop that would definitely kill us if we fell. "Do we have a choice?" The first creature emerged from the forest behind us as we ran toward the log. In full daylight, it was even more horrible than I'd imagined. Its skin was mottled and pale, hanging loose in places like an ill-fitting costume. Its limbs moved in ways that suggested too many joints, and when it opened its mouth to emit another of those hunting calls, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. Ray reached the log first and started across without hesitation, arms outstretched for balance. The ancient wood creaked ominously under his weight but held. I was 3 steps behind him when more creatures emerged from the forest, at least 5 of them, all variations on the same nightmarish theme. Some were taller, some broader, but all shared that awful grinning mouth and those hungry, intelligent eyes. The lead creature reached the edge of the ravine as I stepped onto the log. It didn't attempt to follow. Instead, it crouched at the lip of the drop and watched us with what I can only describe as amusement, as if our escape was temporary. A brief intermission in a game it was certain to win. Halfway across the log, I made the mistake of looking down. The ravine was deeper than I'd thought, easily a 100-foot drop to jagged rocks and white water. The log swayed under my weight, and I heard Ray cursing as he fought to maintain his balance. "Don't look down, just keep moving." I focused on his voice, on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the way the wood flexed and groaned with each step. Behind me, I could hear the creatures moving along the edge of the ravine, pacing us, their calls taking on what sounded almost like laughter. Ray reached the far side and turned to help me across the final few feet. His face was pale but determined, and seeing him there gave me the strength to push through my terror and complete the crossing. We collapsed on solid ground, gasping and shaking. Across the ravine, the creatures had gathered at the edge, watching us with those predatory grins, but they made no attempt to follow. "Why aren't they coming after us?" Ray panted. I stared at the things across the gap, counting at least 7 of them now. They seemed patient, unhurried, as if they knew something we didn't. That's when I realized the truth that made my blood freeze. They weren't trying to catch us, they were hurting us. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't escaping, we were being driven exactly where they wanted us to go. The creatures across the ravine continued their patient vigil, confirming my worst fears. This was all part of their plan. "Ray," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady, "we need to think about this. They could have caught us back there, but they didn't. They're pushing us somewhere specific." Ray wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across his brow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're not running away from them. We're running towards something worse." The forest on this side of the ravine felt different, older. The trees were massive, their trunks scarred with what looked like claw marks that went back decades. Moss hung everywhere like funeral shrouds, and the air carried a stench of decay that made breathing unpleasant. But we had no choice except to keep moving. Behind us, the creatures had begun to make their way around the ravine. I could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movements with disturbing intelligence. We followed what might have been an animal trail deeper into the ancient forest. Every step took us further from civilization, further from any hope of rescue. Our radios remained useless, producing only static and that strange scratching sound that seemed to mock our attempts at communication. "There," Ray whispered, pointing ahead. Some kind of structure. Through the gaps in the trees, I could make out weathered wooden posts and what looked like the remains of a roof. As we got closer, I realized it was an old logging cabin, probably abandoned for 50 years or more. The walls were intact but covered in moss and decay, and the windows were dark holes that seemed to watch our approach. "Should we check it out?" Ray asked. "Maybe there's something we can use? Supplies, another radio, a landline." I didn't like the idea of trapping ourselves in an enclosed space, but the cabin might offer temporary refuge while we figured out our next move. And Ray was right. Old logging operations sometimes maintained communication equipment that might still function. We approached the cabin carefully, listening for any sound from within. The door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I peered inside and saw a single room filled with rotting furniture and debris. But there was something else. Scratches on the walls, similar to the marks we'd seen on the trees, but deeper and more deliberate. "Someone's been here recently," I said, pointing to fresh boot prints in the dust on the floor. Ray examined the prints. "These look official, heavy treads, probably Park Service or law enforcement, but they're at least a week old." We searched the cabin quickly but found nothing useful. No radio, no phone, no supplies. Just more of those disturbing claw marks and a smell that reminded me of rotting meat. But there was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. Photographs, dozens of them pinned to the walls and scattered across a moldering table. All showed the same subject, the creatures we'd encountered, but in different locations, different seasons. Some of the photos looked recent, taken with digital cameras. Others were older, faded Polaroids that must have been decades old. "Jesus," Ray breathed, examining a particularly clear image that showed one of the creatures crouched over what looked like human remains. "Someone's been tracking these things for years." I picked up a photo that made my blood run cold. It showed the same clearing where we'd found Jessica and Michael's campsite, but the image was date-stamped from 6 months ago. In it, 3 of the creatures were feeding on something that had once been human. "They have a pattern," I said, studying the collection of photographs. "They hunt in this area regularly, and someone's been documenting it." Ray found a notebook buried under the photos. Its pages water-damaged but still readable. The handwriting was small and cramped, filled with observations and theories about the creature's behavior. Day 47. Observed hunting pack behavior. They coordinate attacks using subsonic calls below human hearing range. Intelligence level appears higher than initially estimated. Day 52. Found remains of Portland hiking group. Same pattern, psychological torture before physical attack. They seemed to feed on fear as much as flesh. Day 63, attempted to track them to their lair. Found system of caves approximately 2 miles north of Timber Creek. Do not attempt to enter alone. Counted at least 20 individuals. The entries went on for months, documenting a systematic study of the creatures. But the final entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my hands shake. Day 127, they know I'm watching them. Found my old camp destroyed, equipment scattered. Had to abandon research. If anyone finds this notebook, do not attempt to hunt these things. They're too intelligent, too organized. Call in military support, or better yet, evacuate the entire forest and carpet bomb the area. These things cannot be allowed to spread. Ray, I said, my voice hoarse. We need to get out of here, now. But when I looked up, Ray was gone. I spun around the small cabin, panic rising in my throat. The door was still open, the forest beyond silent and still. No sound of struggle, no cry for help. He had simply vanished. Ray, I called out, then immediately regretted making noise. If the creatures had taken him, shouting would only bring them back for me. I grabbed the notebook and stuffed it into my jacket, then carefully approached the cabin door. The boot prints Ray had been examining were still there, but now there was something else. A new set of tracks leading away from the cabin. These weren't human. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. They led directly into the darkest part of the forest, toward what the notebook had called their lair. I had a choice to make. I could try to find my way back to the ravine, attempt to reach civilization and call for backup. Or I could follow those tracks and try to rescue Ray, knowing it was almost certainly a trap. The decision was made for me when I heard Ray's voice calling from somewhere in the forest ahead. He sounded terrified, desperate, begging for help. But there was something wrong with his voice, a quality that made my skin crawl. As if it wasn't quite human anymore. I remembered reading about creatures that could mimic human voices, luring rescuers into ambushes. But what if it really was Ray? What if he was still alive? Still savable? I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my service pistol drawn and ready. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made me flinch and spin around. The trees grew larger and more twisted as I went deeper, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it was like walking through a twilight world. Ray's voice continued to call out. Always just ahead, always out of sight. But the tone was changing, becoming less human, more predatory. Whatever was making those sounds was enjoying the game, savoring my fear and desperation. The tracks led to the mouth of a cave system carved into a hillside. The opening was huge, easily 20 feet across, with smaller passages branching off into darkness. And from somewhere deep within came the sound of movement. Lots of movement, as if dozens of large creatures were stirring in the depths. Ray's voice called out from inside the cave, but now I could tell it wasn't really him. The pitch was wrong, the inflection off, like a recording played through damaged speakers. They had captured Ray, learned his voice, and were using it to lure me into their lair. I stood at the cave mouth, weighing my options. Going in was suicide. I'd be trapped in their territory, outnumbered and outmatched. But leaving Ray to whatever fate awaited him in those tunnels was something I couldn't live with. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. Fresh tire tracks in the mud outside the cave. Recent ones, made by heavy vehicles, possibly military or law enforcement. And scattered around the cave entrance were items that definitely didn't belong. Spent shell casings, fragments of body armor, what looked like part of a tactical radio. Someone else had been here, recently, and they'd brought serious firepower. I followed the tire tracks away from the cave, moving as quietly as possible. They led to a temporary camp hidden in a grove of trees about half a mile from the cave system. Canvas shelters, military-grade equipment, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. But the camp was empty, abandoned, and from the state of the equipment, scattered, damaged, covered in those familiar claw marks. Whoever had been here had met the same fate as everyone else who ventured into these woods. I was examining a damaged radio when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, gun raised, and found myself face to face with a figure in military fatigues. But something was wrong with him. His movements were too fluid, his smile too wide, and when he spoke it was with Ray's voice. "Marcus, thank God you found me. We need to get out of here right now." But it wasn't Ray. The face was right. The voice was right. But the eyes belonged to something else entirely. Something that had been studying me, learning me. preparing to replace me just as it had replaced my partner. I pulled the trigger without hesitation. The thing wearing Ray's face crumpled to the ground, black ichor spreading from the bullet wound in its chest. But even as it died, it kept smiling, kept speaking in my partner's voice. "You can't kill us all, Marcus. We're everywhere now. We're everyone you've ever trusted." I put 2 more bullets into its head before the voice finally stopped. The body began to change immediately, reverting to something pale and twisted that bore no resemblance to the man I'd worked with for 3 years. But the worst part was the realization that this thing had been studying Ray, learning his mannerisms, preparing to take his place in the world. How many others had they replaced? How far had this infection spread? I searched the abandoned military camp more thoroughly, looking for clues about who these people were and what they'd discovered. Most of the equipment was standard issue, but I found documents that made my blood run cold. Operation Clearcut, a joint task force between the FBI, CDC, and something called the Department of Anomalous Phenomena. According to the files, the creatures had been contained to this forest for decades, monitored and studied in secret. But something had changed recently. They were becoming more aggressive, more organized, and worst of all, they were learning to mimic human form perfectly. The final report, dated just 3 days ago, was stamped with red letters: "Containment breach. Immediate evacuation recommend." They'd tried to eliminate the creatures with conventional weapons and failed. The things were too smart, too adaptable, and now the military team was gone, either dead or replaced by those perfect mimics. I found a satellite phone among the scattered equipment and tried to call for backup but got only static. The creatures were jamming communications somehow, keeping their hunting ground isolated from the outside world. But I did find something useful: a detailed map of the cave system, marked with the locations of what the researchers called breeding chambers. If Ray was still alive, still human, that's where I'd find him. The caves went deeper than I'd imagined. A vast network of tunnels and chambers that honeycombed the entire mountainside. According to the map, the main nest was almost a mile underground, accessible through several different entrances but heavily guarded by the creatures. I equipped myself with as much military gear as I could carry: night vision goggles, body armor, extra ammunition, and several grenades that I hoped I wouldn't need to use. Then I made my way back to the cave entrance, trying to formulate some kind of plan that didn't end with my death. The tunnel sloped steeply downward, carved from solid rock by something that definitely hadn't used conventional tools. The walls were scored with those familiar claw marks, and the air grew thicker and more fetid with each step I took into the darkness. My night vision revealed a nightmare landscape of organic structures growing from the cave walls, things that looked like cocoons or egg sacs, pulsing with their own internal light, and everywhere, bones. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in elaborate patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. I followed the main tunnel for what felt like hours, guided by the military map and the increasing intensity of the stench. The creatures were down here somewhere, lots of them, but they seemed content to let me penetrate deeper into their domain. Just like before, they were herding me towards something specific. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, larger than a cathedral. And hanging from the ceiling, wrapped in silken cocoons, were the missing people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some of the cocoons were old, their occupants long dead, but others were fresh. I could see movement inside them, hear muffled sounds of distress. The creatures were keeping them alive for some purpose I didn't want to contemplate. And there, hanging about 20 feet above the cavern floor, was Ray. He was conscious, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the silk bonds. When he saw me, he tried to call out, but the webbing covered his mouth. Still, I could see the relief in his expression. He knew I'd come for him, but getting to him would be the challenge. The cavern floor was covered with those creatures, at least 30 of them, all variations on the same nightmarish theme. They moved with purpose, tending to their human harvest like farmers checking their crops. I needed a distraction, something to draw them away from Ray long enough for me to cut him down and get out of here. The grenades would create chaos, but they might also bring down the ceiling and kill everyone in the process. That's when I noticed something that changed my understanding of everything I'd seen. The creatures weren't just keeping people alive as food sources. They were changing them. Some of the cocoons contained figures that were no longer entirely human: elongated limbs, pale skin, faces that were shifting toward that familiar predatory grin. The creatures were converting their captives, turning them into more of their own kind, and some of the conversions were nearly complete. A cocoon near the edge of the chamber split open, and something that had once been human dropped to the cavern floor. It moved with that same fluid grace I'd seen in the mature creatures, but retained enough human features that I could tell it had been a woman, probably young, maybe a hiker who'd gone missing months ago. She looked up at the other captives with hungry eyes, already learning to see them as prey rather than fellow victims. The transformation was as much psychological as physical. Whatever process they used didn't just change the body, it rewrote the mind. Ray had seen it too. His struggles became more desperate, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized what fate awaited him if I didn't act soon. I pulled the pin from my first grenade and threw it toward the far side of the chamber. The explosion lit up the cavern like daylight, and the creatures shrieked in pain and rage as debris rained down on them. In the chaos that followed, I ran toward Ray's position, firing at anything that moved. The creatures were fast, but they weren't expecting a direct assault. I managed to reach the wall beneath Ray and started climbing the rough rock face, using the claw marks as handholds. Below me, the creatures were regrouping, their initial surprise replaced by coordinated hunting behavior. I reached Ray just as the first creature started climbing after me. My knife cut through the silk bindings, and Ray dropped into my arms, gasping for breath as the webbing fell away from his face. "Marcus," he croaked, his voice hoarse from hours of muffled screaming. "They're not just here, they're everywhere. I heard them talking. They've got people in town, in the government, in the police force. This isn't just a local problem anymore." I helped him down from the wall as more creatures began scaling the rock face toward us. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached us, and the only exit was back through the tunnel we'd entered. But Ray grabbed my arm, stopping me from heading toward the entrance. "There's another way out," he said. I heard them discussing it while they were preparing me. "There's a passage that leads to an old mine shaft about 2 miles from here. We can follow it to the surface, avoid their main hunting grounds. Can you walk?" "I'll have to." We ran toward the passage Ray had indicated, creatures dropping from the ceiling around us like predatory spiders. My second grenade bought us enough time to reach the tunnel, but I could hear them following, their calls echoing through the passages, coordinating their pursuit. The tunnel Ray had found was older than the others, carved by human hands rather than creature claws. It sloped gradually upward, and after what felt like hours of desperate flight through the darkness, we finally saw light ahead. We emerged from an abandoned mine entrance on the far side of the mountain, miles from where we'd started our search. The afternoon sun had never looked so beautiful, and the simple act of breathing clean air felt like a miracle. But our relief was short-lived. Ray was changing. I noticed it first in his eyes. They were becoming larger, more reflective. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality, and when he smiled, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were definitely not human anymore. "Ray," I said quietly, backing away from him. "When did they take you? How long were you in that cocoon?" He tilted his head with that same predatory curiosity I'd seen in the creatures. "Long enough, Marcus. Long enough to understand what we really are, what we're meant to become." The transformation was accelerating now that he was free of the cocoon. His limbs were elongating, his face reshaping itself into something hungry and alien. But worst of all, he was still talking in his familiar voice, still using the mannerisms and speech patterns that had made him my friend. "You can't fight evolution, Marcus. They're not invaders, they're the next step. And soon everyone will understand. Everyone will join us." I raised my pistol but hesitated. Some part of me still hoped that Ray was in there somewhere, still fighting the change. But when he lunged at me with inhuman speed and strength, I pulled the trigger. Ray's body crumpled to the ground, already reverting to its alien form as the transformation completed itself in death. I stood over my partner's corpse, realizing that the man I'd known was probably gone long before I'd found him in that cavern. The notebook I'd taken from the cabin was still in my jacket. I pulled it out and read the final entry again, understanding now why the researcher had recommended military intervention. This wasn't just about a few monsters in the woods. This was an invasion, a slow-motion conquest that had been going on for decades. And if Ray was right, if they really had infiltrated human society, then it might already be too late. I needed to reach civilization, needed to warn someone who might actually be able to do something about this threat. But as I looked down at Ray's alien corpse, I realized the terrible truth. How could I tell who was human and who was merely pretending to be? The sun was setting by the time I reached the main road, painting the forest in shades of red that reminded me too much of blood. I'd been walking for 3 hours, following old logging roads and game trails, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that nightmare underground. My radio finally crackled to life as I got closer to civilization, but the voices I heard made my blood freeze. "Search teams report no sign of Bennett or Sullivan," came the familiar voice of dispatch. Extend search perimeter to include the northern ridgeline. It was Sarah Martinez, the dispatcher I'd worked with for years. But there was something wrong with her cadence, a subtle difference in inflection that made my skin crawl. She sounded like Sarah, but underneath was something else, something that was trying very hard to sound human. I switched off the radio and kept walking. If they'd gotten to Sarah, who else had been replaced? How long had this been going on? The thought that I might have been working alongside these things for months or even years made my stomach churn. A Park Service vehicle approached from ahead, slowing as it recognized me walking along the roadside. Through the windshield I could see Tom Bradley, the veteran ranger who'd briefed us that morning. Was it really just this morning? It felt like a lifetime ago. The truck pulled over, and Tom leaned out the window with obvious relief. "Marcus, thank God, we've been looking everywhere for you and Ray. What happened out there?" I studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of the subtle wrongness I'd learned to recognize. Tom looked normal, sounded normal, but so had the thing wearing Ray's face. "Ray's dead," I said simply, watching Tom's reaction. His expression crumpled with genuine grief, or what looked like genuine grief. "Jesus, how? Was it an animal attack? Something like that?" I climbed into the passenger seat, keeping my hand near my weapon. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Have you noticed anything different about people lately? Anyone acting strangely, saying things they wouldn't normally say?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "What kind of different?" I told him everything. The creatures in the forest, the underground nest, the military operation that had failed to contain them, Ray's transformation, and most importantly, the evidence that they could perfectly mimic human beings. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the darkening forest. "I was afraid something like this might be happening," he said finally. "There have been incidents, people going missing and then turning up days later with no memory of where they'd been. Hikers reporting encounters with things that shouldn't exist. And you're right about people acting strangely. I've noticed it too, especially in the last few months." "Who?" I asked. "Sarah Martinez, for one. She's been different since she came back from that sick leave last month. More distant, asking strange questions about our protocols and procedures. And there are others. Park employees, local police, even some folks in town. The implications were staggering. If the creatures had been systematically replacing key personnel in the area, they could control information flow, manipulate investigations, and ensure that their activities remained hidden from outside scrutiny." "We need to contact federal authorities," I said. "FBI, CDC, military. Someone with the resources to deal with this." Tom nodded, but his expression was grim. "The question is, who can we trust? If they've infiltrated local law enforcement and Park Service, what's to say they haven't reached higher levels?" It was a chilling thought. The creatures had shown remarkable intelligence and patience. If they'd been operating for decades, they could have people placed throughout the government, the military, anywhere they needed influence. We drove toward town in tense silence, both of us scanning the roadside for any sign of movement. The forest looked different now, not peaceful and majestic, but predatory, full of watching eyes and hidden threats. "There's something else," Tom said as we approached the outskirts of the small mountain community. "I've been keeping records of missing persons cases in the area going back 20 years. The pattern is disturbing." He pulled a folder from under his seat and handed it to me. Inside were dozens of case files, each documenting the disappearance of hikers, campers, and local residents. But what made my hands shake was the pattern Tom had highlighted. Every few months, someone would go missing. Then, weeks or sometimes months later, they would reappear with no memory of where they'd been. Medical examinations always showed them to be in perfect health, but families and friends would report subtle changes in personality and behavior. "They've been building their infiltration network for 2 decades, I said, understanding the scope of what we were facing. Taking people, converting them, sending them back to blend into society. And now they're accelerating the process. In the last 6 months, we've had more disappearances than in the previous 5 years combined." We reached the town limits as full darkness fell. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light that seemed inadequate against the surrounding darkness, and I found myself scrutinizing every person we passed, wondering which ones were still human. Tom parked in front of the sheriff's station, but made no move to get out of the truck. "Problem is, I don't trust Sheriff Morrison either," he said quietly. "He's been different since his fishing trip last spring. More methodical, like he's following a script." "Then who can we trust?" "I don't know. But I have an idea. Tom reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small digital camera. I've been documenting some of the strange things I've observed. Photographs, video recordings, notes. If we can get this evidence to the right people, maybe we can convince someone to take action. He showed me images on the camera's LCD screen, creatures moving through the forest at night, caught in the infrared flash, shots of people in town who showed subtle but unmistakable signs of transformation, and most damning of all, video footage of what looked like a town meeting where half the attendees moved with that same fluid grace I'd learned to recognize. My God, I breathed. How many of them are there? In town, maybe a third of the population, possibly more. They're concentrated in positions of authority: police, government, medical personnel, anyone who could influence or control the community. The scope of the infiltration was overwhelming. This wasn't just a handful of monsters in the woods. It was a coordinated takeover of an entire community, and possibly just the beginning of something much larger. We need to leave, I said. Get to the nearest major city, find federal agents who couldn't possibly have been compromised. Tom nodded, but as he started the engine, we heard the wail of sirens approaching from multiple directions. Red and blue lights flashed in our mirrors as police cruisers converged on our location. Shit, Tom muttered. They know we're here. The first cruiser pulled up behind us, trapping us against the sheriff's station. I could see the silhouette of the driver, but something about the way he sat, the angle of his head, looked wrong. More vehicles arrived, sheriff's deputies, Park Service rangers, even what looked like federal agents in unmarked cars. But I was beginning to doubt that any of them were actually human. Tom, I said quietly, do you have another way out of town? Back roads, Forest Service routes, anything they might not know about. There's an old fire road that connects to the interstate about 20 miles north. But we'd have to get past them first. The officers were getting out of their vehicles now, moving with that coordinated precision I'd seen in the creatures. They surrounded our truck but made no immediate attempt to approach. Just like in the forest, they seemed content to wait, to savor our fear. Sheriff Morrison walked up to Tom's window, his familiar face wearing an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tom, Marcus, he said in a voice that sounded exactly like the sheriff I'd known for years. We've been looking for you. There are reports of dangerous animals in the area. We need to get you somewhere safe. But I could see the lie in his eyes, the predatory hunger that no amount of acting could completely hide. We're fine, Sheriff, Tom replied. Just heading home. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Not until we've had a chance to debrief you about what you encountered out there. For your own safety, of course. The thing wearing Sheriff Morrison's face smiled, but the expression was too wide, too knowing. It understood that we knew what it was, and it was enjoying the game. Tom, I whispered. On my signal, floor it. He nodded almost imperceptibly, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. The sheriff leaned closer to the window, and I could smell that familiar stench of decay emanating from his apparently human form. Now, I shouted. Tom gunned the engine, tires squealing as we shot forward between two parked cruisers. The officers, or things wearing officers' faces, scattered with inhuman speed and agility, but made no attempt to stop us with gunfire. They wanted us alive. We raced through the town's empty streets, Tom taking turns at dangerous speeds as we headed for the old fire road he'd mentioned. Behind us, sirens wailed as the entire compromised law enforcement apparatus gave chase. There! Tom pointed to a gap in the trees barely wide enough for our truck. That's the fire road. We plunged into the forest, branches scraping against the windows as we followed the narrow, winding track. The headlights illuminated a nightmare landscape of twisted trees and hanging moss, and I caught glimpses of pale figures moving between the trunks, pacing our escape. They were everywhere. The entire forest was alive with them, and we were driving deeper into their territory with every mile. Tom, I said, studying the fuel gauge. We're not going to make it to the interstate on what we have left. I know a place we can stop for gas. Old ranger station about 10 miles ahead. It's been abandoned for years, but I keep supplies there for emergencies. The fire road seemed to go on forever, winding through increasingly dense forest. Our pursuers had fallen back, but I could still hear their calls echoing through the trees. That same inhuman communication I'd heard in the cave system. We reached the abandoned ranger station just as the fuel gauge hit empty. The building was dark and overgrown, but Tom led me to a concealed fuel depot behind the structure. As he worked to fill the tank, I kept watch for any sign of pursuit. The forest around us was silent, but it felt like the silence of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Almost done, Tom muttered, wrestling with the old pump. That's when I saw the lights approaching through the trees. Not the harsh glare of headlights, but the softer illumination of flashlights and lanterns. They were coming on foot, moving through the forest with the patience of experienced hunters. We need to go. Now. Tom finished fueling the truck and we climbed back in, but as he turned the key, the engine coughed and died. He tried again. Nothing. They've sabotaged something, he said, popping the hood. In the beam of his flashlight, I could see severed wires and damaged components. We're not driving out of here. The lights were getting closer, and I could make out figures moving between the trees. Dozens of them, all wearing the faces of people I'd known and trusted. The radio tower, Tom said suddenly. There's an old emergency transmitter up on the ridge. If we can reach it, we might be able to get word out. It was a slim hope, but better than waiting here to be captured. We gathered what supplies we could carry and headed up the steep trail toward the ridge, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Behind us, the forest filled with those hunting calls as our pursuers closed in. The climb seemed endless, our lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Several times I heard movement in the trees around us, but when I turned my light toward the sounds, I saw only shadows and twisted branches. We reached the radio tower just as dawn began to break over the mountains. The old emergency transmitter was still functional, powered by solar panels and a backup battery system. Tom worked frantically to establish contact while I kept watch on the trail below. "Mayday, mayday," Tom spoke into the microphone. "This is Ranger Station 47 requesting immediate federal assistance. We have a biological contamination event in progress, multiple civilian casualties. Need immediate military intervention." Static filled the speaker, then a familiar voice responded. "Tom, this is dispatch. We've been looking for you. What's your location?" It was Sarah Martinez again, that same false concern in her voice. "They're monitoring all frequencies," I said. "We can't trust anyone." But Tom had an idea. He switched to an emergency frequency used by the military, one that civilian agencies wouldn't normally monitor. Any station. This is Cascade National Forest requesting immediate assistance. We have confirmation of hostile biological entities. Request immediate sterilization protocol for grid reference." He rattled off coordinates that encompassed the entire infected area. The response came after several tense minutes. In a crisp military voice I didn't recognize. "Cascade Station, this is Colonel James Mitchell, Joint Chiefs Biological Response Team. We copy your transmission and are aware of the situation. Extraction team en route to your position. ETA 30 minutes. Maintain your position and avoid contact with any unidentified personnel." Relief flooded through me. Someone in the military knew about the threat and was taking action. "How did they know?" I asked. Tom looked grim. "Remember that failed military operation I found evidence of? They probably have contingency plans in place. This might not be the first outbreak they've dealt with." We waited on the ridge as the sun climbed higher, watching the forest below for any sign of our pursuers. The creatures seemed to have pulled back, perhaps sensing that external forces were about to intervene. Right on schedule, we heard the sound of helicopters approaching from the east. 3 military choppers crested the ridge and circled our position. Then one touched down while the others provided cover. Soldiers in full hazmat gear emerged from the aircraft, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. One of them approached with a scanner of some kind, running it over both Tom and me before giving an all-clear signal. "Are you the ones who made the emergency transmission?" The soldier's voice was muffled by his protective gear. "Yes," Tom replied. "We have evidence of extensive biological contamination, hostile entities that can mimic human form. The entire area needs to be quarantined." The soldier nodded. "We know. This situation has been escalating for weeks. You're lucky to have survived this long." As we climbed aboard the helicopter, I looked down at the forest one last time. It looked peaceful in the morning light, beautiful even. But I knew the truth of what lurked beneath that green canopy. "What happens now?" I asked the soldier. "Containment," he replied. "Full sterilization of the infected zone. We can't let this spread any further." As the helicopter lifted off, I saw other aircraft approaching from the horizon. Bombers flying in formation, carrying enough ordnance to level the entire forest. But even as we flew toward safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too late. The creatures had been spreading for decades, infiltrating communities, replacing key personnel. How many other forests harbored similar infestations? How many towns had already been compromised? The war for humanity's survival had begun, and I wasn't sure we were winning. 3 months later, I testified before a closed congressional committee about what I'd witnessed in the Cascade National Forest. The official story was a terrorist biological weapon test that had been successfully contained. The forest remained off limits, designated as a permanent environmental hazard zone. But I knew the truth was more complex. The creatures had been too organized, too intelligent to be completely eradicated by conventional weapons. Some had undoubtedly escaped the bombing, gone deeper underground, or fled to other territories. And sometimes, late at night, I got reports from other search and rescue teams in other forests. Stories that sounded all too familiar. Missing hikers, strange tracks, people who came back changed. The infection was spreading, and I was one of the few people who knew what to look for. I transferred to a desk job, but I kept in touch with search and rescue teams across the country, building a network of people who could recognize the signs. We called ourselves the Watchers, and our job was to identify new outbreaks before they could spread. Because the truth is, the forest is patient. It's been here longer than humanity, and it's willing to wait as long as necessary to reclaim what it considers its own. And late at night, when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I can almost hear them calling. Those voices that sound almost human but not quite. They're still out there, still hunting, still learning, and they're getting better at pretending to be us. The screaming started at 4:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was staring at my radio's digital display when the first shriek tore through the static, a sound so raw and desperate it made my coffee mug slip from numb fingers. 23 years as a park ranger in the North Cascades, and I'd never heard anything like it, not from any animal I knew. My name is Rowan, and I thought I'd heard every sound these mountains could make. The cry came again. Closer this time, carrying on the pre-dawn wind that swept down from the glacier-carved peaks surrounding my station. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. Something caught between the two, struggling against its own throat to produce noise. The hairs on my arms stood rigid as I reached for the radio. "Base, this is Cascade Station 7, do you copy?" Static answered me. The kind of thick, oppressive static that meant something was wrong with more than just the weather. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch of my ranger station. The beam cut through darkness so complete it seemed solid, revealing only the first few feet of the trail that wound down toward Hidden Lake. Above, stars wheeled in patterns I'd memorized during countless sleepless nights, but tonight they looked different. Colder, more distant. The screaming had stopped, but something worse had replaced it. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush, not crashing through like a panicked deer or lumbering like a bear, but moving with deliberate stealth. Branches bent rather than broke, leaves rustled in patterns too organized to be natural. I'd been assigned to this remote station precisely because I preferred solitude. The nearest town was 40 miles down a logging road that washed out every spring. The nearest colleague was stationed 60 miles east. Most people would call it isolation. I called it peace. Until this morning, I'd never felt truly alone. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Cascade 7, this is base. We're getting reports of missing hikers in your sector. Party of 4, overdue by 18 hours. I pressed the transmit button, grateful to hear another human voice. Copy that, base. I haven't seen anyone come through in 3 days. What's their last known position? Hidden Lake area. They were supposed to check in yesterday evening. Hidden Lake. The trail that started 50 yards from where I stood. Base, I'm hearing unusual wildlife activity in that direction. Sounds like something's injured or agitated. A pause. When Base came back, the dispatcher sounded tired. Copy that. We've had similar reports from other sectors. Fish and Wildlife thinks it might be related to the unseasonable temperature drop. Animals are behaving strangely. I'd noticed the cold snap, 10 degrees below normal for mid-September, with a wind that carried the bite of winter despite the calendar. But cold weather didn't explain the coordination I'd heard in those movements. Cold weather didn't explain the almost human quality of that scream. I'll head down to the lake at first light and look for signs of the missing party, I told Base. Negative, Cascade 7. Wait for backup. We're sending a team your way, ETA 6 hours. 6 hours. I looked down the dark trail and felt something shift in the forest around me. Not the settling of cooling wood or the rustle of small creatures. Something watching. Something waiting. Copy, Base. I'll monitor from the station. But as I spoke, I heard it again. Not the scream this time, but something infinitely worse. The sound of someone calling for help. A voice, definitely human, carried on the wind from the direction of Hidden Lake. Help me, please. Someone help me. I grabbed my pack and rifle. Policy said wait for backup. But 23 years in these mountains had taught me that policy was written by people who'd never heard someone dying alone in the dark. The voice called again, weaker now, fading. The trail to Hidden Lake was 2 miles of switchbacks carved into the mountainside. I knew every route and rock, but in the pre-dawn darkness with my flashlight creating a narrow tunnel of visibility, the familiar path felt foreign. The trees leaned in too close. The shadows moved wrong. Halfway down, I found the first sign. The beam of my light caught something white against the dark earth. A piece of fabric, torn and stained with something that looked black in the flashlight's glow. I knelt and picked it up, immediately recognizing it as part of a hiking shirt. Good quality fabric, the kind serious backpackers wore. But it wasn't the fabric that made my hands shake. It was how it had been torn. Not ripped by thorns or torn by a fall, but systematically shredded, methodically destroyed. As if something had been trying to understand how clothing worked by taking it apart piece by piece. The voice called again, much closer now. "Help! Down here." I could see the lake through the trees, its surface black as obsidian under the starlight. My light swept the shoreline and caught movement near the water's edge. A figure waving frantically. "I'm coming," I called, picking up my pace despite every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The figure by the lake was a woman in her 30s, blonde hair matted with dirt and what looked like blood. She wore the remnants of hiking clothes, though most of her gear was missing. As I approached, she stumbled toward me. "Thank God," she gasped. "I've been calling for hours. Something happened to the others. Something took them." I swept my light across her face, noting the scratches on her cheeks, the way her pupils didn't quite track the beam properly. Shock, I thought. Exposure and trauma. "What's your name?" I asked, unshouldering my pack to get the first aid kit. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Mitchell. We were camping by the lake when it happened. I didn't see any camping gear. No tent, no scattered supplies, nothing to indicate anyone had made camp here recently. But trauma could explain the confusion. When what happened, Sarah?" She looked back at the dark water, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "It came out of the forest around midnight. At first we thought it was a bear, but it walked wrong. Stood up like a person, but its arms hung too long, and its face," she shuddered. "It wasn't right. Like someone had tried to remember what a face looked like but got the proportions wrong." I'd heard stories like this before. Traumatic encounters with wildlife, filtered through fear and adrenaline, could create monsters where there were none. But something about the way she described the proportions being wrong made my skin crawl. "Where are the others now?" Sarah pointed toward the far end of the lake. "It took them into the trees. I hid behind a boulder until dawn, but I could hear them screaming for hours. Then it got quiet, and I started calling for help." I raised my radio. "Base, this is Cascade 7. I found one of the missing hikers, requesting immediate medical evacuation and search team." Static answered me. Complete radio silence. "Base, do you copy?" "Nothing." Sarah grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You have to help me find them. They might still be alive." I looked into her eyes and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Her pupils were perfectly normal now, tracking my movements with predatory precision. And when she smiled, I saw that her teeth were filed to points. "Don't you want to help me, Rowan?" she asked, and her voice was different now, layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. I hadn't told her my name. My rifle was in my hands before I consciously decided to raise it, but Sarah was already moving. Not running, but flowing like liquid mercury, her form seeming to blur and shift in my flashlight beam. I squeezed the trigger, but the shot went wide as she rolled behind a fallen log. "You can't help them," her voice called from the darkness, but now it came from 3 different directions at once. "But you can join them. Wouldn't that be better? No more lonely nights in your little station. No more wondering what that sound was in the forest." I backed toward the trail, keeping my rifle raised, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I heard movement all around me, as if the forest itself had come alive. "The others fought so hard at first," the voice continued, seeming to come from the trees now. "But eventually they understood. Eventually they invited me in." Something moved in my peripheral vision and I spun toward it. In the wash of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a person, but stretched and wrong, with arms that hung past its knees and a face that looked like clay molded by blind hands. I ran. The 2 miles back to my station felt like 20. Behind me I could hear pursuit, but not the sound of footsteps. Instead, it was the whisper of something sliding through the underbrush, keeping pace with me effortlessly. Sometimes I thought I heard Sarah's voice calling my name from the darkness, but now I knew it wasn't really her. I burst through my station door and immediately started barricading it with furniture. My radio was still dead, my cell phone showed no signal, and my landline produced only static. Whatever was happening, I was cut off from the outside world. As I worked to secure the windows, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. Through the glass barely visible in the starlight, figures stood at the edge of the clearing around my station. 4 of them, perfectly still, watching me work. One raised its hand in a slow wave, and I recognized the gesture as distinctly human. But the proportions were all wrong, just as Sarah had described. Arms too long, fingers that seemed to have too many joints. Dawn was still hours away, and I was beginning to understand that the real horror wasn't what was outside. It was the growing certainty that whatever had taken Sarah and the others wasn't finished hunting. The figures remained at the tree line until sunrise. I spent those endless hours crouched behind my overturned desk, rifle trained on the door, watching their silhouettes through gaps in my makeshift barricades. They never moved, never spoke, just stood in perfect stillness like scarecrows forgotten by their maker. When the first rays of sunlight finally crested the eastern peaks, they simply melted back into the forest shadow by shadow, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I hadn't. The soft earth around my station was crisscrossed with tracks unlike anything in my field guides. Elongated human footprints, but with claw marks extending from the toe impressions. The stride length suggested someone over 7 feet tall, but the depth of the prints indicated something far heavier than any person. My radio came back to life with the dawn, crackling with normal morning chatter from other stations. I tried to raise base, but when I reported the previous night's events, dispatch sounded skeptical at best. Cascade 7, are you sure about these proportions you described? Could trauma have affected the witness's perception? Base, I saw them myself. 4 figures watching my station. The tracks are still here. A pause. Copy that. The search team is still en route. ETA 4 hours. Maintain position and document what you can. 4 hours felt like a lifetime, but I used them productively. I photographed the tracks, mapped their positions, and tried to piece together what I was dealing with. The evidence suggested something intelligent, possibly using the missing hikers' appearances as camouflage. But that explanation required accepting possibilities that existed far outside normal parameters. The search team arrived exactly on schedule. 2 other rangers I'd worked with before, Martinez and Thompson, plus a county sheriff's deputy named Kowalski. They examined my photos with professional skepticism. These could be bear tracks, Martinez offered, squatting next to one of the clearer impressions. Black bears sometimes leave claw marks like this. Bears don't walk upright for extended distances, I replied. And they don't stand perfectly still for 6 hours watching a building. Thompson found something that made my theory more difficult to dismiss. 50 yards into the forest, he called us over to examine what looked like a campsite. Tattered remains of tents, scattered gear, and a cold fire ring surrounded by the same elongated footprints. This matches the gear description for our missing party, Kowalski said, photographing everything methodically. But where are the bodies? We spread out to search, following different track patterns deeper into the woods. I took the trail that led north, toward the high country where few hikers ventured. The tracks here were fresher, and I noticed something disturbing. They were leading somewhere specific, not wandering randomly like a confused animal might. 3 miles from the campsite, I found what they were leading to. The clearing was almost perfectly circular, surrounded by trees that had been stripped of bark in spiral patterns. At the center stood what I can only describe as a construction project, though construction implies purpose and design. This was more like the work of something trying to remember how to build a shelter but getting the concept fundamentally wrong. Branches had been woven together into structures that hurt to look at directly. Not because they were grotesque, but because they seemed to follow architectural principles that my brain couldn't process. Walls that curved in directions that shouldn't exist. Doorways that appeared to lead inside and outside simultaneously, and scattered throughout this impossible construction were pieces of the missing hikers. Not bodies, but pieces of clothing, equipment, and personal effects arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately meaningful but remained utterly incomprehensible. I was photographing everything when I heard Thompson scream. His voice carried across the forest with the same desperate quality I'd heard the night before. I grabbed my radio as I ran back toward his position. Martinez, Kowalski, Thompson's in trouble, converging on his location. Martinez's voice crackled back immediately. Copy that. I can see him from here. He's just standing by a tree, not moving. I reached them 3 minutes later, but 3 minutes had been enough. Thompson stood perfectly still next to a massive pine, his back to us. When Martinez called his name, he didn't respond. When I walked around to see his face, I understood why. His expression was blank, eyes focused on something infinitely distant. He was breathing, standing upright, apparently uninjured. But Thompson wasn't home anymore. Something else was looking out through his eyes. "Thompson," I said carefully, "can you hear me?" He turned his head toward me with mechanical precision. And when he smiled, it was with someone else's mannerisms entirely. "Hello, Rowan," he said in Thompson's voice. But wrong somehow. Like someone doing an impression of him based on second-hand descriptions. "Isn't this a beautiful morning?" Martinez raised his rifle. Kowalski stepped back, hand on his weapon but not yet drawing it. I kept my own rifle lowered but ready. "What happened to Thompson?" I asked. "Thompson invited me in," he replied, tilting his head at an angle no human neck could comfortably achieve. "Just like Sarah did. Just like all of them did, eventually." "That's not Thompson," Martinez whispered. The thing wearing Thompson's face laughed with Thompson's voice, but the timing was wrong, the inflection off. "Of course it's Thompson. These are his memories, his voice, his body. I'm just wearing them better than he did." It started walking toward us, and I noticed that Thompson's familiar stride had been replaced by something that looked choreographed, each step placed with deliberate precision. "The others are waiting for you back at the clearing," it continued conversationally. "Sarah and the hikers. They're so excited to meet you properly this time." Kowalski had his service weapon out now. "That's far enough." Thompson's face turned toward him with that same mechanical precision. "Oh, you don't want to do that." Thompson's body still needs to work properly, and bullets would make that difficult. "What are you?" I asked. "I'm what happens when you invite the wrong thing inside," it replied. "I'm what's been waiting in these mountains for so very long for someone to finally let me in." It was close enough now that I could see Thompson's eyes weren't quite right. The pupils were dilated, and there was no recognition in them, no hint of the man I'd worked with for 7 years. "Thompson fought so hard at first," it continued, "but eventually he understood. The loneliness you feel up here, Rowan, the isolation that drives people to these remote assignments, it makes you vulnerable. Makes you eager for connection, even connection with something like me." "You're wrong about that," I said, raising my rifle. "Some of us came here precisely to be alone." Thompson's face showed what might have been surprise, though the expression sat wrongly on features I'd known for years. "Interesting," it said. "Thompson was so sure you'd be the easiest to convince." Martinez fired first, putting 2 rounds center mass. Thompson's body staggered backward but didn't fall. Dark fluid leaked from the wounds, but not blood. Something thicker, with an oily iridescence. "Now that was rude," Thompson's voice said mildly. "And wasteful. This body won't last as long now." It moved toward Martinez faster than anything wearing human flesh should have been able to move. I put 3 rounds into it, aiming for areas that would disable a person immediately. The shots found their mark, but the thing just kept coming. Kowalski had the right idea. Instead of trying to stop Thompson's body, he aimed for the head. The heavy caliber round took off the top of Thompson's skull, revealing an interior that was nothing like human anatomy. Where brain tissue should have been, there was instead a writhing mass of what looked like fungal growth, pale tendrils that pulsed with their own rhythm. The thing continued moving for several seconds after the shot, Thompson's ruined face still wearing that wrong smile. When it finally collapsed, the fungal mass began dissolving rapidly, leaving behind only Thompson's corpse and a smell like rotting flowers. We stood in silence for several minutes, staring at what remained of our colleague. Finally, Martinez voiced what we were all thinking. "What the hell was that thing?" I knelt next to Thompson's body, careful not to touch the dark fluid that continued seeping from his wounds. "Something that uses people as disguises. Something that's been here longer than we have." "And it said there were others," Kowalski added. "Sarah and the hikers." I looked back toward the clearing where I'd found that impossible construction. "We need to get out of these mountains. Radio for evacuation and containment. This is beyond park ranger capabilities." But even as I said it, I knew we weren't leaving, not yet. The thing had known too much about us, about the isolation that had drawn us to this work. It had studied us, prepared for us, and somewhere in these woods, wearing the faces of people we'd sworn to protect, more of them were waiting. We should have left immediately. Policy, common sense, and basic survival instinct all demanded that we evacuate and call in specialists. But Thompson had been our friend, and the thing wearing his face had promised that more people were still alive in that clearing. We made the worst decision of our lives and went back. The circular clearing looked different in daylight, though not in any way that made it less disturbing. What I'd taken for impossible architecture in the pre-dawn darkness was revealed to be something far more practical and infinitely more horrifying. The structures weren't defying physics. They were following a different set of rules entirely. Each twisted construction was carefully positioned to create sight lines that shouldn't work. Standing in one spot, you could see into 3 different rooms simultaneously, despite the fact that basic geometry said this was impossible. Move 2 feet to the left, and the same spaces became invisible, replaced by viewing angles into completely different areas. It's like a maze designed by someone who doesn't understand 3 dimensions, Martinez whispered. Kowalski was more practical in his assessment. It's a trap. This whole thing is designed to confuse and disorient anyone who enters. I was photographing the construction when I noticed movement in one of the impossible viewing angles. A figure sat in what appeared to be a chair woven from branches, perfectly still. From this distance it looked human. There, I pointed. Northeast section, about 40 meters. We approached carefully, weapons ready, but the figure didn't react to our presence. As we got closer, I recognized the hiking clothes I'd seen described in the missing persons report. One of the lost party, a young man in his 20s, he sat with his back straight, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing with Thompson's same vacant expression. When we called to him, he turned with that mechanical precision I was beginning to recognize. "Hello," he said in a voice too flat to be natural. "I've been waiting for you. What's your name?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "My name is Kevin Morrison. I'm 24 years old. I work as a software engineer in Seattle. I came here with 3 friends for a long weekend of hiking. The information was delivered like someone reading from a script. Would you like to meet the others?" Without waiting for an answer, he stood and began walking deeper into the construction. We had no choice but to follow. The path he took shouldn't have been possible given what I'd observed from the clearing's edge, but somehow we found ourselves moving through spaces that hadn't existed moments before. The woven walls curved around us, creating corridors that led in directions my compass insisted were impossible. Kevin led us to another clearing within the construction, where 3 more figures sat in identical woven chairs. A woman in her 30s, an older man with graying hair, and another young man, all sitting perfectly still, all wearing that same vacant expression. "This is Linda, Robert, and James," Kevin announced with the enthusiasm of a tour guide. "We're all very happy here. The host has been so accommodating." The woman called Linda turned toward us. "Yes, so accommodating. It's wonderful not to have to make decisions anymore. Not to have to worry about anything. The loneliness is gone," added Robert. Finally, we're not alone." I'd heard enough. "Where is your host?" All 4 figures turned to look at me simultaneously, and when they smiled, it was with identical expressions that had never belonged to human faces. "The host is everywhere," they said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that hurt to hear. "The host is in us, with us, around us. The host has been so patient, waiting so long for visitors who would understand." Martinez had his rifle trained on Kevin, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. These were victims, not enemies. Killing them would be murder, even if they were no longer entirely themselves. "What does your host want?" I asked. Linda tilted her head in that mechanical way. "To not be alone, to share the gift of connection, to help others understand that isolation is a choice, and such a painful choice. You could join us," James offered. "It's not unpleasant. The host is very gentle when you don't resist." Robert nodded enthusiastically. "The fear goes away first. Then the loneliness, then all the little anxieties and worries that make human life so difficult. What's left is perfect peace." I was beginning to understand what we were dealing with. Not just a predator, but something that saw itself as offering a service. A cure for the human condition that nobody had asked for. "And if we refuse?" Kowalski asked. All 4 figures looked sad, though the expression sat wrongly on their features. "The host doesn't like to force anyone," Kevin said. "But sometimes people need time to think about it. Sometimes they need to see how nice it can be." The construction around us began to change, walls shifting and reconfiguring themselves. What had been passages leading back toward the forest were now dead ends. What had been dead ends now opened onto deeper sections of the maze. "You're free to leave any time you choose to join us," Linda explained helpfully. "The host isn't unreasonable." Martinez turned in a complete circle, mapping our new situation. Every direction led deeper into the construction. The way we'd entered had simply ceased to exist. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Time works differently now," Robert replied. "Sometimes it feels like minutes, sometimes like years. But it doesn't matter because we're not afraid anymore." I was taking photographs of everything, though I doubted the pictures would capture the spatial impossibilities we were experiencing. The digital timestamps on my camera were jumping around randomly, suggesting that whatever was happening here affected more than just physical space. "The host would like to speak with you directly," James announced suddenly. "If you're ready." The four figures stood simultaneously and began walking toward what appeared to be the center of the construction. Again we followed, because the alternative was being lost in a maze that reconfigured itself according to rules we didn't understand. The center turned out to be another circular clearing, this one dominated by a single massive structure that hurt to look at directly. It resembled a tree, but one that had been grown rather than built, with branches that curved through impossible angles and roots that seemed to extend both down into the earth and up into the sky. Sitting in the shadow of this impossible tree was the source of our troubles. At first glance, it looked almost human, tall, slender, with elongated limbs and features that might have been attractive if they'd been arranged according to human proportions. But the more I looked, the more the details became wrong. Fingers that had too many joints, eyes that were too large and too dark, skin that had a subtle iridescent quality like oil on water. When it stood, it moved with liquid grace that was beautiful and horrible simultaneously. When it spoke, its voice was like music played just slightly out of tune. "Welcome," it said, and the words seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly." This was what had been wearing Sarah's face the night before. What had taken Thompson? What had turned four hikers into hollow puppets? "What are you?" I asked. It tilted its head considering the question. "I'm what grows in the spaces between lonely thoughts. I'm what fills the gaps left by isolation and fear. Your species creates so much emptiness, and I simply provide connection. By taking over their minds, by offering partnership, by sharing the burden of consciousness. Your friends here were in so much pain before I helped them. The weight of individual existence, the constant struggle against meaninglessness. Now they're part of something larger." Martinez had his rifle trained on the creature, but I could see his hands shaking. Not from fear, but from something else. A subtle relaxation, as if the tension he'd been carrying for years was slowly draining away. "Don't listen to it," I warned him. "It's getting into your head." The creature smiled with too many teeth. "I'm not forcing anything, I'm simply offering what everyone wants, to not be alone anymore, to not have to carry the weight of decision and consequence and fear." Kowalski was swaying on his feet, his weapon lowering despite his obvious attempts to keep it raised. It does sound peaceful. Fight it," I ordered. But my own voice sounded distant to my ears. The creature's presence was like a drug, offering relief from every source of human suffering. "Why fight?" it asked reasonably. "Look at your friends here. Kevin and Linda and Robert and James, they're happier now than they've ever been. No more wondering if they're making the right choices, no more fear of the future, no more loneliness in the dark." I could feel its influence creeping into my thoughts, offering solutions to problems I'd been carrying for decades. The isolation that had driven me to seek remote assignments wasn't strength, it was wound, and this creature was offering to heal it. But something in me rebelled against the offer. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the recognition that what the creature called healing was actually obliteration. Either way, I managed to raise my rifle and put 3 rounds center mass. The bullets passed through it without effect, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. It looked down at itself with mild interest, then back at me with something like respect. "Interesting," it said. "You're stronger than most. Thompson lasted 7 minutes before he invited me in. You've been resisting for almost 20. I'm not interested in what you're selling, but your friends are." I looked around and realized that Martinez and Kowalski had lowered their weapons entirely. They stood with the same vacant expressions I'd seen on Thompson and the hikers, their resistance finally crumbling under the creature's psychic pressure. "Hello, Rowan," Martinez said in that familiar but wrong voice. "Isn't this a beautiful day?" I was alone with 7 hollow puppets and a creature that fed on human loneliness. The construction around us began shifting again, walls closing in to create a more intimate space. The creature stepped closer, its impossible proportions becoming more pronounced. "You don't have to be afraid," it said gently. "I know what you've been running from all these years. The feeling that you don't quite fit anywhere, that human connection requires more energy than it provides. I can fix that. I can make it so you never feel isolated again." It was offering exactly what some part of me had always wanted. To belong somewhere completely, without reservation or pretense. To never again experience that specific loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who couldn't quite understand you. But belonging wasn't supposed to require the elimination of self. I backed away from the creature, bumping into one of the woven walls. It felt solid enough, but when I pressed against it, my hand passed through as if it were made of spider webs. "There's nowhere to run," the creature said. not unkindly. "This place exists in the spaces between spaces. You can only leave when you're ready to join us." That's when I realized what I had to do. The creature fed on loneliness, but it also required it. It needed isolated people, people who were vulnerable to its offer of connection. But what if someone genuinely preferred solitude? What if loneliness wasn't a wound to be healed, but simply a different way of being? I stopped running and turned to face the creature. "You're wrong about me," I said, lowering my rifle. "You think I came to these mountains because I was lonely. You think I took this remote assignment because I was afraid of human connection." The creature paused, its two large eyes reflecting my image in ways that suggested it saw more than just physical form. "Aren't you?" "No. I came here because I prefer solitude. There's a difference between being lonely and being alone. Loneliness is the absence of something you need. Solitude is the presence of something you choose." For the first time since encountering it, the creature looked uncertain. "But the emptiness I sense in you isn't emptiness, it's space. Room to think, room to breathe, room to exist without constantly negotiating my place in relation to others. You see it as a void to be filled, but it's actually fullness of a different kind." The 7 hollow puppets around us began showing signs of agitation, their vacant expressions flickering with something that might have been confusion. The creature's influence over them seemed to waver as its attention focused entirely on me. "I don't understand," it admitted. "That's your limitation," I replied. "You can only conceive of human consciousness in terms of connection and disconnection. You can't imagine someone who simply operates differently." I started walking toward it, and for the first time, the creature backed away. "You feed on loneliness, but you can't feed on chosen solitude. You can offer connection to someone who desperately needs it, but you can't offer anything meaningful to someone who's already complete." The impossible construction around us began to shake, as if the creature's confusion was affecting its ability to maintain the spatial distortions. Walls that had seemed solid moments before flickered like mirages. "Your friends invited me in," it protested weakly, "because they were running from something. Thompson was afraid of growing old alone. Martinez was carrying guilt about his divorce. Kowalski was struggling with depression after his partner died. They all had wounds that you could promise to heal." I could see understanding beginning to dawn in those 2 large eyes. "But you have no wounds for me to heal." "I have scars, but they're old and well integrated. I have problems, but I prefer to solve them myself. I have moments of sadness, but I don't mistake them for inadequacy." The creature's form began to blur at the edges, as if it were having trouble maintaining cohesion. The 7 puppets swayed on their feet, their vacant expressions clearing to reveal confusion and growing horror as they began to remember who they were. "This isn't possible," the creature whispered. "Everyone needs connection. Everyone fears isolation. Everyone needs different things," I corrected. "And the difference between need and preference is something you've never learned to distinguish." Martinez blinked hard and looked around in confusion. What happened to us?" "You were being used," I told him, not taking my eyes off the creature. "This thing fed on your loneliness, used it to hollow you out and wear you like a mask." Kowalski was checking his service weapon with shaking hands. "How long were we?" "A few hours, but it felt longer, didn't it? Time works differently when you're not really present in your own mind." The 4 hikers were in worse shape, having been under the creature's influence for days. But they were waking up, returning to themselves as the creature's concentration failed. "I don't understand," Kevin Morrison said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I remember agreeing to something, but I can't remember what." "You agreed to give up the burden of being yourself," I explained, "in exchange for never having to feel lonely again." The creature made a sound like wind through dead leaves. "This changes nothing. There are others in these mountains. Others who will invite me in." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But now I know what you are, and I know how to fight you. You're not some ancient evil or cosmic horror. You're just a parasite that's learned to offer tempting bargains to people in pain." I raised my rifle again, though I knew bullets wouldn't affect it. "And parasites can be starved." The creature's form was becoming increasingly unstable, wisps of shadow trailing from its extremities. "You can't kill me. I exist in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps left by unmet needs. I'm not trying to kill you. I'm just refusing to feed you." That's when I understood the real nature of our situation. The creature didn't just feed on loneliness, it required active participation from its victims. They had to choose to invite it in, had to willingly surrender their autonomy in exchange for the promise of connection. But someone who genuinely preferred solitude couldn't make that bargain. Someone who found fulfillment in their own company had nothing the creature could offer. and nothing it could take. The impossible construction was collapsing around us, walls dissolving and passages straightening into normal forest paths. The creature's ability to manipulate space was failing along with its confidence. "Help me understand," it pleaded, its voice becoming more desperate. "Help me see what you see." And in that moment, I almost felt sorry for it. This thing that fed on loneliness was itself profoundly lonely. Unable to connect with others except through domination and consumption, it literally couldn't conceive of healthy solitude because it had never experienced anything but isolation and parasitism. "I can't help you," I said gently, "because help isn't what you need. You need to learn to exist without consuming others, and that's something you have to figure out yourself." The creature's form began to fade, becoming translucent. "But I'll be alone." "Yes, you will. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing once you stop seeing it as a problem to be solved." With that, it was gone. Not destroyed, but simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. The impossible constructions vanished with it, leaving us standing in a normal forest clearing surrounded by scattered camping gear. Martinez looked around in confusion. "What happened to all those twisted buildings?" "They were never really there," I replied. "The creature created them by manipulating our perceptions. Reality is much simpler than it wanted us to believe." We spent the next hour helping the rescued hikers orient themselves and providing basic first aid for dehydration and exposure. Kevin Morrison had the most coherent memory of their ordeal. "It felt like dreaming," he explained. "Like being half asleep for days, aware of what was happening but not really present for it. I remember agreeing to something, but the reasons felt so logical at the time." "It offered you connection," I said. "An end to loneliness and isolation. For most people, that's a compelling bargain, but not for you." I looked around at the forest that had been my home for over 2 decades. I never thought loneliness was a problem that needed fixing. Sometimes being alone is just being alone. We hiked out together, a group of 8 where there had been 3 that morning. The creature was gone, but I knew it wasn't destroyed. Something like that didn't die, it just moved on to find more suitable hunting grounds. But I also knew it would avoid me in the future. I represented something it couldn't understand or assimilate. The difference between loneliness as suffering and solitude as choice. That night, back at my station, I filed my official report. I stuck to the facts that could be verified. Missing hikers found, suspected exposure to hallucinogenic compounds, possible predator activity in the area. The parts about space-bending constructions and psychic parasites would remain in my personal log, a reminder that not all threats in the wilderness were of the conventional variety. 3 days later, I received a transfer offer to a station closer to town, with more colleagues and better communication infrastructure. The kind of assignment that would ensure I was never truly isolated again. I declined. Some people need connection to thrive, others need solitude. The creature's mistake had been assuming that everyone fell into the first category, that isolation was always a wound rather than sometimes being a choice. I'd chosen these mountains, this solitude, this particular way of being alone. And no amount of supernatural intervention was going to convince me that my choice was wrong. But as I settled in for another night of comfortable isolation, I couldn't shake the memory of the creature's final words. "But I'll be alone." Maybe that was its real tragedy. It had spent so long consuming others' loneliness that it had never learned to transform its own isolation into chosen solitude. That was a lesson it would have to learn on its own, if it ever learned it at all. Spring came early to the Cascades that year, but I barely noticed the changing seasons. I'd spent the winter months expecting the creature's return, monitoring radio chatter for reports of missing persons, analyzing every unusual sound in the forest around my station, but the mountains remained quiet, offering nothing more threatening than the occasional black bear or confused elk. The transferred rangers who'd taken over the lower elevation stations reported normal wildlife activity. The hiking trails reopened on schedule. Tourists returned to Hidden Lake without incident, leaving behind nothing more sinister than scattered trail mix and forgotten water bottles. It was as if the events of the previous autumn had been a fever dream, notable only for their complete absence of lasting evidence. But I knew better. The creature hadn't been destroyed. It had simply learned that I wasn't suitable prey. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the North Cascades, it was still hunting, still offering its bargain of connection in exchange for autonomy, still finding people desperate enough to accept. I received confirmation of this theory in late April when a hiker named David Chen stopped by my station on his way to the backcountry. He was planning a solo trek through some of the more remote areas, the kind of journey that attracted people seeking either adventure or escape. "You're the ranger who found those missing hikers last year," he said, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. The ones who got lost for 3 days. That's right, I replied carefully. The official report had focused on exposure and disorientation, omitting the more unusual details. What really happened out there? I looked at David Chen more carefully. He was in his 40s, obviously experienced in wilderness travel, but carrying himself with the kind of tension that suggested he was running from something. His gear was expensive and well-maintained, but his eyes had the hollow quality I'd learned to recognize in people who'd been alone too long. They got separated from their campsite during a storm, I told him, sticking to the official version. Spent 3 days wandering in circles before we found them. That's all? What else would there be? David was quiet for a moment, staring past me toward the forest. I've been having dreams, he said finally, about voices in the woods. Voices offering to help with the loneliness. My blood went cold. Dreams? Started about a month ago. Someone calling my name from the trees, promising that I don't have to be alone anymore. The dreams feel so real that I wake up expecting to find someone waiting outside my house. The creature was still active, still hunting. It had learned to extend its influence beyond direct contact, reaching into the minds of vulnerable people through dreams and whispered promises. David, I said carefully, why are you really here? He looked at me with eyes that were already beginning to show the glassy quality I remembered from Thompson and the others. I think I'm supposed to meet someone in the woods. Someone who can help me with the loneliness. There's no one in these woods who can help with that. Trust me on this. But I could see that he wasn't really hearing me anymore. The creature had been working on him for weeks, preparing him, making him eager for the encounter it was promising. David Chen was already lost. He just didn't know it yet. I need to go, he said, shouldering his pack. I've been planning this trip for months. I couldn't stop him legally. He was an experienced hiker with proper permits, and nothing in his behavior suggested immediate danger to himself or others. But I knew with absolute certainty that he was walking into a trap. David, wait. I grabbed a piece of paper and quickly wrote down my radio frequency. Check in every 12 hours. If I don't hear from you by tomorrow evening, I'm sending a search team. He took the paper with a distracted smile. Sure, whatever makes you feel better. I watched him disappear down the trail toward the deeper wilderness, carrying with him the scent of desperation that the creature found so irresistible. Then I spent the next hour trying to convince myself that there was nothing more I could do, but that was a lie, and I knew it. By evening, I was packed and ready to follow David's trail. I'd spent the afternoon studying topographical maps, identifying the most likely locations for the creature to make its approach. Remote areas with natural clearing, places where sound would carry and escape routes would be limited. I left detailed instructions with Base about my plans, though I couldn't explain my real reasons without sounding delusional. Instead, I filed it as a routine backcountry patrol, the kind of preventive measure that was part of my normal duties. David's trail was easy to follow. He'd made no effort at stealth, leaving behind clear boot prints and the occasional piece of litter that would normally have irritated me. But tonight those signs of human passage were reassuring, proof that he was still functioning normally. That changed around midnight. I was following the trail by flashlight when I noticed that David's footprints had been joined by others. The same elongated impressions I'd seen the previous autumn, with claw marks extending from the toe areas. The creature had found him, but these tracks were different somehow. Instead of the predatory stalking pattern I'd observed before, they seemed almost companionable, as if David and the creature were walking together by mutual agreement. The trail led northeast, toward a series of high alpine lakes that few hikers visited. Remote country where someone could disappear for weeks without anyone noticing. Perfect hunting territory for something that needed privacy to work its influence. I reached the first lake around 2 a.m., guided by the glow of a campfire that shouldn't have been there. David had stopped to make camp, despite having planned to hike through the night. As I approached carefully, I could hear voices carrying across the still water. David was talking to someone, his voice animated in a way that suggested deep conversation. The other voice was harder to make out, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, but I recognized its musical quality. I circled the lake to get a better view of the campsite, moving carefully to avoid detection. Through my binoculars, I could see David sitting by the fire, apparently alone but clearly engaged in dialogue with an invisible companion. "I've been so lonely," he was saying. "Ever since the divorce, ever since the kids stopped calling. It feels like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming invisible." The creature's voice responded, though I couldn't make out the words from this distance. Whatever it was saying, David was nodding enthusiastically. "Yes, exactly, you understand. Nobody else understands. I'd seen enough." The creature was beginning its seduction, offering David the connection he'd been craving. Within hours, maybe less, David would invite it in, and another hollow puppet would be walking through my forests. I had to intervene, but I also had to be smart about it. Direct confrontation had worked before because I'd been immune to the creature's influence. But this time, I was dealing with someone who was actively cooperating with it. I worked my way around the lake until I was positioned directly across from David's campsite. Then I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out across the water, "David, it's Ranger Rowan. Are you all right?" The effect was immediate. David jumped to his feet, looking around in confusion. The creature's voice went silent, and I could sense its irritation at the interruption. "I'm fine," David called back, though his voice sounded strained. "Just camping like I planned." "Who are you talking to?" A pause. "Nobody. Just talking to myself." I knew the creature was listening, weighing its options. It could try to influence me again, but it had learned that I was resistant to its offers. It could flee with David, but that would mean abandoning the careful psychological preparation it had been conducting. Or it could try something new. "David," the creature's voice said, loud enough now for me to hear clearly across the lake. "Your friend the ranger is very lonely too. He's spent years hiding in these mountains, telling himself that isolation is a choice when really it's just fear." I felt the familiar psychic pressure as it turned its attention toward me. But this time the approach was different. Instead of offering connection, it was offering understanding. "He thinks he's different from you," the creature continued, "but he's just as desperate for meaningful contact, just as afraid of being truly seen by another person. Why else would he spend his life in a place where human interaction is minimal?" The attack was more sophisticated this time, targeting my self-perception rather than my loneliness. It wasn't offering to fix anything, it was simply suggesting that my understanding of my own motivations was flawed. "Don't listen to it, David," I called. "It's trying to manipulate both of us." But David was already turning back toward the fire, where I could now see the creature's form beginning to materialize. Tall and elegant and wrong, offering a smile that contained too many teeth. "The ranger followed you here," it said to David, "because he's desperate to save you. But who is he really trying to save? You or himself?" That gave me pause. Had I followed David into the wilderness because I genuinely wanted to help him, or because I needed to prove something to myself about the nature of solitude and connection? "Does it matter?" I called back, surprising myself with the question. The creature's form solidified further, becoming more human-looking but retaining its impossible proportions. "Doesn't it? If your motives are selfish, if you're here because you need to be needed, then aren't you just as lonely as David?" I found myself actually considering the question. Was my preference for solitude genuine, or was it a defense mechanism against the fear of rejection? Was I helping David because it was right, or because it made me feel important? "It's a good question," I admitted, "but it's also irrelevant." The creature tilted its head. "How so?" "Because even if my motives are mixed, even if I'm here partly for selfish reasons, David still deserves better than being turned into a hollow puppet. Good outcomes can come from imperfect motivations." I started walking around the lake toward David's campsite. "And you still deserve better than an existence built on consuming other people's pain." "I'm offering partnership," the creature protested. "Mutual benefit. You're offering obliteration disguised as connection. There's a difference between sharing consciousness and consuming it." As I approached the campsite, David turned to look at me with eyes that were still his own, though I could see the creature's influence growing stronger by the moment. "Ranger," he said, "I think I need to stay here. I think this is where I belong." "David, look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem lonely to you?" He studied my face in the firelight. I don't know. Maybe. I've spent 23 years working alone in these mountains. I've chosen assignments that minimize human contact, turned down promotions that would require more social interaction, built a life around solitude. And I'm genuinely happy with those choices." The creature made a sound like wind through dying trees. "Happiness is irrelevant. Connection is what matters." "Connection matters to some people," I corrected. "But not to everyone. And not in the same ways. David needs human connection to feel complete. I need solitude to feel complete. Neither of us is wrong. We're just different." I looked directly at the creature. "And you need to learn the difference between connection and consumption." David was wavering, torn between the creature's promises and my words. I could see the battle playing out in his expression, hope warring with confusion. "What if I choose to stay?" he asked finally. "What if this is what I want?" "Then that's your choice," I said, meaning it. "But make sure it's really your choice, not just the result of having your loneliness manipulated by something that feeds on human desperation." The creature's form began to blur again, its confidence shaken by my refusal to engage in the philosophical battle it was trying to create. You cannot stop what people choose for themselves. You're right, but I can make sure they're choosing with complete information. I sat down by David's fire, uninvited but not unwelcome. David, let me tell you exactly what happened to the other people who made this bargain. Let me tell you what you'll become if you invite this thing in. For the next hour, I described Thompson's transformation. The vacant expressions of the hikers, the way their personalities had been consumed and replaced by something that wore their faces like masks. I described the impossible constructions, the spatial distortions, the sensation of being trapped in a maze designed by something that didn't understand human psychology. The creature listened in silence, unable to deny the accuracy of my account, but equally unable to argue against the conclusions I was drawing. When I finished, David was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. It really promised they would never be lonely again, he said finally, and it kept that promise. They weren't lonely anymore because they weren't really themselves anymore. Their loneliness was gone because they were gone. David looked up at the creature, which had retreated to the edge of the firelight. Is that true? The creature's response was telling in its evasiveness. Loneliness is a form of suffering. I eliminate suffering by eliminating the sufferer, by integrating them into something larger than themselves. That's not the same thing, David said, and I could hear his resolve solidifying. I want to feel less lonely, not stop being me. The creature made one last attempt. Your pain will only grow worse. Isolation will consume you slowly year by year, until you become bitter and afraid and completely cut off from human warmth. Maybe, David acknowledged. But that's my risk to take, and there are other ways to address loneliness, I added. Therapy, support groups, gradually building social skills and connections. Difficult ways, but ways that don't require surrendering your identity. The creature's form began to fade, its influence waning as both David and I rejected its bargain. You cannot protect everyone from their own choices. No, I agreed. But I can make sure they understand what they're choosing. With that, it was gone again, leaving David and me alone by the dying fire. He looked exhausted but relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, he said. I don't think I would have been strong enough to resist on my own. Strength isn't the issue. Understanding is. That thing preys on people who think loneliness is a personal failing rather than just a temporary condition that can be addressed. We spent the rest of the night talking about practical strategies for dealing with isolation and building connections. I gave him contact information for wilderness therapy groups, hiking clubs, volunteer organizations, ways to address his loneliness without surrendering his identity. As dawn broke over the alpine lake, David packed his gear and prepared to hike out. What about you, he asked. Don't you ever get lonely up here? I considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. Loneliness is missing connection you need. Solitude is enjoying connection with yourself. And the difference is important, crucial. That creature feeds on people who can't tell the difference. David nodded and started down the trail towards civilization, where he would begin the difficult but necessary work of building genuine connections with other people. I watched him go, then turned back toward my station and the comforting embrace of chosen solitude. The creature was still out there, still hunting, still finding people desperate enough to accept its bargain. But now I understood it better, and I knew how to fight it. Not with weapons or force, but with education and understanding. Loneliness was not a personal failing. Solitude was not necessarily isolation. Connection could be built without consumption. And sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was help them understand the difference. I returned to my station as the sun climbed higher over the Cascades, grateful for the silence and the space and the particular kind of fullness that came from being comfortably, deliberately alone. Behind me, the forest whispered with wind and wildlife, offering no voices but the ones that belonged there. It was exactly as it should be. The rain hadn't stopped in 43 days. I know because I've been counting, marking each gray dawn with a slash on the wood frame of my ranger station window. The droplets don't just fall here in the Hoh rainforest, they seep into everything, turning the world into a living, breathing organism of moss and decay. Today the forest feels different though, hungrier. My name is insignificant now, just another sound the trees have learned to swallow. What matters is that I'm the only ranger stationed in this forgotten corner of Olympic National Forest, where the tourist trails end and the real wilderness begins. 300 square miles of ancient cedar and hemlock, stretching toward the Pacific like gnarled fingers reaching for something they can never touch. The radio crackles to life, startling me from my morning coffee ritual. Static washes over the frequency before dispatch comes through. her voice tight with something I recognize but don't want to name. Range Station 7, we have a missing persons report. Family of 4, last seen entering your sector yesterday morning. Vehicle located at the Elwha River trailhead, but no sign of the occupants. I set down my mug, the ceramic clicking against the wooden desk with finality. Copy that, dispatch. Any description of the missing party? Affirmative. 2 adults, 2 children, ages 8 and 12. They were expected back last night. Local authorities are requesting immediate assistance. The forest outside my window seems to lean closer as I grab my gear. In my 5 years stationed here, I've handled dozens of missing hiker cases. Most end with embarrassed families found camping in the wrong spot, or day hikers who took a wrong turn and spent a cold night under the stars. But something about the silence this morning, the complete absence of bird calls or small creature movements, sets my teeth on edge. The drive to the trailhead takes 20 minutes on roads that barely deserve the name. Mud grabs at my truck's tires, trying to hold me back as if the forest itself wants to keep me away from whatever waits ahead. When I arrive, I find the missing family's SUV exactly as reported. Doors unlocked, windows down despite the rain, personal belongings scattered across the seats like they'd been abandoned in panic. Their hiking permits are still clipped to the dashboard. The Michelson family from Portland. Dad, mom, little boy, teenage daughter. The photographs paper-clipped to their permits show typical family vacation smiles, the kind that make my chest tight because I know how quickly the wilderness can erase those expressions forever. I study the trailhead registry, running my finger down the logged entries. The Michelsons signed in at 9:47 a.m. yesterday. According to the log, they were the only hikers to enter this section in the past week. That should make tracking them easier, but as I examine the muddy trail, I realize something is wrong. Their footprints begin normally enough. 4 distinct sets heading into the forest. 2 adult boot prints, 1 pair of smaller hiking shoes, and what look like tennis shoes from the youngest child. But after about 50 yards, the prints become erratic, scuffed, overlapping in patterns that suggest confusion or fear. And then, at exactly the 70-yard mark, they simply stop, not fade away, not disappear into rocky terrain. Stop. As if the family had been lifted straight up into the canopy above. I spend the next hour searching in expanding circles from the last footprint, looking for any indication of where they might have gone. The underbrush shows no signs of passage, no broken branches, no disturbed moss, no torn fabric on thorns. It's as if the Michelson family simply ceased to exist at that precise spot on the trail. The radio remains silent despite my attempts to call in the anomaly. The deeper I venture into the forest, the more the static increases, until even dispatch's voice becomes an unintelligible whisper beneath layers of electronic snow. This isn't unusual. The terrain here plays hell with radio signals, but today the static sounds almost purposeful, like something is actively jamming the frequency. By noon, the rain has intensified to the point where visibility drops to maybe 10 feet in any direction. The forest canopy blocks most of the daylight, creating a perpetual twilight that makes everything look subtly wrong. Trees seem to shift position when I'm not looking directly at them. Shadows move independent of any breeze. I'm about to head back for additional equipment when I hear it. Children laughing. The sound comes from deeper in the forest, perhaps a quarter mile off the official trail. My first instinct is relief. The family is alive, probably just lost and making the best of their situation. But as I listen more carefully, something about the laughter makes my skin crawl. It's too high-pitched, lasting too long, and it echoes in a way that doesn't match the acoustics of dense forest. Following the sound means leaving the marked trail, but if there's a chance the family is out there, I have no choice. I tie bright orange surveyor's tape to trees as I go, creating a path back to safety. The laughter continues, always seeming to come from just beyond my range of vision, leading me deeper into parts of the forest I've never explored despite years of patrols. The trees here are wrong. Not diseased or damaged, but wrong in a way that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembers when humans were prey. The bark has an unusual texture, too smooth in some places, too rough in others, with patterns that almost look like no. I force myself to focus on the search. After 30 minutes of following the phantom laughter, I find something that makes me question my sanity. Carved into the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, about 8 feet off the ground, are 4 human handprints, not carved by tools but pressed into the living wood as if the bark were soft clay. The prints are the right sizes for the Michelson family, 2 adults, 2 children, but they're positioned in a way that would be impossible for humans to create. The angles are wrong, the spacing defies anatomy, and they're far too high off the ground. Below the handprints, sap has begun to ooze from the tree in long, dark streams. But it's not the usual golden amber of Douglas fir sap. This substance is deep red, almost black, and it moves with a consistency that reminds me uncomfortably of blood. The laughter stops abruptly as if someone had turned off a radio. The silence that follows is absolute. No rain, no wind, no forest sounds at all. Even my own breathing seems muted, absorbed by something hungry in the air around me. That's when I notice the smell. It starts as something almost familiar, like meat cooking over a campfire, the kind of aroma that should trigger pleasant memories of family gatherings and outdoor adventures. But underneath that comforting scent lurks something else, something sweet and cloying that makes my stomach turn and my mouth water simultaneously. I back away from the tree, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. But before I can call for backup, I hear footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. Slow, deliberate steps that don't quite match human gait patterns. "Hello?" I call out, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the oppressive silence. "Michelson family? Is that you?" The footsteps stop. For a moment there's nothing but the sound of that red sap dripping steadily onto the forest floor. Then, from somewhere behind the massive fir tree comes a voice that might have once belonged to a human child. "We're playing hide and seek. Want to play with us?" The words are spoken in perfect English, but there's something fundamentally wrong with the vocal cords producing them. The tone wavers between frequencies, as if multiple voices are speaking in unison while trying to imitate a single child. Every instinct I've developed during years in the wilderness screams at me to run, but 4 people, a family with children, are missing somewhere in these woods. Whatever game is being played here, whatever has happened to the Michelsons, my job is to find them and bring them home safely, even if home is the last place any of us will ever see again. I take a step toward the voice, my hand gripping the tactical flashlight on my belt. The beam cuts through the perpetual twilight, revealing nothing but more trees stretching endlessly into the gloom. "I'm here to help," I say, surprised by how steady my voice sounds. "Your parents are looking for you." The giggling starts again, but now it's coming from multiple directions at once. Above me, below me, from inside the trees themselves. The sound builds and multiplies until it becomes a symphony of childish laughter that makes my bones ache and my vision blur. And in that moment, as the forest fills with impossible sounds, I realize that whatever happened to the Michelson family is about to happen to me. The laughter cuts off like someone closing a door. In the sudden quiet, I can hear my heart hammering against my ribs loud enough to scare away any normal wildlife for miles. But there is no normal wildlife here. Nothing moves in the underbrush, no birds call from the canopy, and even the ever-present drip of rain has stopped. I shine my flashlight in a slow arc around my position, trying to penetrate shadows that seem to actively resist illumination. The beam reveals only trees, moss, and the occasional fern, but something is wrong with the proportions. Distances that should be familiar look stretched and distorted, as if I'm viewing the forest through a funhouse mirror. "My name is Officer," I call out, catching myself before using any specific title. Something tells me that names have power here, and I'm not ready to give mine away. "I'm with the Forest Service. If you can hear me, please respond." Silence. Then, from behind a tree roughly 30 feet to my left, a small hand waves. Just for a second, pale fingers wiggling in what might be a greeting or might be something else entirely. I approach cautiously, stepping around fallen logs and pushing through clusters of sword ferns that seem denser than they should be. When I reach the tree, there's no one there, but pressed into the soft earth at its base is a child-sized footprint. The impression is deep and perfectly formed, but wrong in a way that makes my vision blur when I try to focus on it. The print has 5 toes, like a human foot, but they're arranged in a semicircle rather than the straight line of normal human anatomy. And the heel extends too far back, ending in what might be a claw mark dragged through the soil. I'm photographing the print with my phone when I hear crying. Soft, heartbroken sobs coming from deeper in the forest. Unlike the laughter, this sound feels genuinely human. A parent's grief, raw and immediate. Following the sound, I tie more surveyor's tape to mark my path. The forest floor here is spongy with decades of decomposed leaves and fallen needles. Each step sinks slightly, and when I lift my boot, dark water seeps up to fill the impression. The crying gets louder as I go, but it's moving too, leading me in a wide circle that brings me back to the same tree where I started. Impossible. I've been walking in a straight line for at least 10 minutes. But there's my original surveyor's tape, bright orange against the dark bark, and there's the same disturbed footprint in the soil. The crying has stopped, replaced by whispered conversation. Multiple voices speaking too quietly for me to make out words, but the rhythm and cadence suggest an argument, or perhaps a negotiation. I check my compass and GPS unit, both of which should be reliable even in heavy forest cover. The compass needle spins lazily without settling on any direction. The GPS shows my location as a series of question marks. This isn't possible, I mutter, then immediately regret speaking aloud. The whispers stop instantly, and I have the distinct impression that whatever was talking has now turned its attention entirely to me. A branch cracks somewhere above my head. I aim my flashlight up into the canopy, and for just a moment I glimpse something that makes my knees buckle. High in the branches, perhaps 40 feet off the ground, hangs what might once have been a person. The figure is suspended upside down, arms dangling limp, but its limbs are too long and bent at impossible angles. When I blink and look again, there's nothing there. The radio on my belt crackles with static, then suddenly clears. Dispatch's voice comes through, tinny but audible. Range Station 7, please respond. We're showing your location as uncertain. What's your current status? I grab the radio, relief flooding through me. This is Station 7. I'm approximately 1 mile east of the Elwha River trailhead, following the missing persons case. I've found evidence of the family but no direct contact yet. Copy that. Be advised, we've received additional reports of missing hikers in your area. 3 separate parties in the past week, all last seen entering the forest from different access points. My blood goes cold. How many people total? 11 individuals, range from age 6 to 62. All experienced hikers with proper equipment. 11 people missing in a forest I patrol regularly, and I had no idea. How is that possible? I keep meticulous logs of everyone who enters my sector. I know every trail, every camping spot, every potential hazard. Dispatch. I'm going to need backup out here. Multiple units, and bring tracking dogs if available. Static fills the radio for several seconds before dispatch responds. Station 7, did you say you need backup? Your transmission is breaking up. I repeat the request, speaking directly into the radio. But even as I talk, I can hear my own words becoming distorted, stretched and warped by something in the air around me. Station 7. We can barely. You. Please. Your coordinates. The radio goes dead. I try several more times to reach dispatch, but get only white noise that gradually shifts into something that almost sounds like voices. Whispering voices, the same ones I heard in the forest, but now coming from my own equipment. I switch off the radio and clip it back to my belt. Whatever is happening here, I'm on my own until I can get back to clear ground. That's when I notice the trees have changed again. The massive Douglas fir with the handprints carved into its bark is gone, replaced by a grove of alder trees that shouldn't exist at this elevation. The understory plants are wrong too. Species that typically grow in coastal areas mixed with alpine varieties that require entirely different soil conditions. It's as if the forest is reassembling itself around me, showing me pieces of different ecosystems stitched together without regard for natural law. I need to get back to the official trail. Using the surveyor's tape I left, I begin retracing my steps, moving from one orange marker to the next. But the path they describe doesn't match the route I remember taking. Instead of leading back toward the trailhead, the tape guides me in a descending spiral, deeper into areas that don't appear on any map. The third time I find myself back at the same fallen log, a massive cedar trunk covered in brilliant green moss. I admit that I'm lost, not just geographically lost, but lost in a way that defies explanation. The forest is playing with me, rearranging itself like a living puzzle designed to trap anyone who ventures too far from safety. I sit on the fallen log to reassess my situation. The rain has started again, but it's falling upward, rising from the ground in slow droplets that disappear into the canopy above. Even gravity has become unreliable here. That's when I see the first sign of the missing hikers. Hanging from a low branch about 20 feet away is a backpack. It's new-looking, expensive outdoor gear in forest green, the kind that would cost several $100s and last for decades of hard use. I approach carefully, scanning the ground for footprints or other signs of human passage. The backpack is suspended at exactly eye level, hanging from a rope that's been tied with expert knots. Too expert. The kind of complex knots that would require significant experience in mountaineering or sailing. Inside the pack, I find the usual hiking gear: water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, waterproof matches. But I also find something that makes my hands shake as I examine it. A journal, leather-bound and water-stained. filled with entries dated over the past month. The handwriting is neat, precise, documenting what appears to be a long-term camping expedition. But the content of the entries becomes increasingly disturbing as I read. Day 12. The forest is beautiful but feels watched. Sarah says she keeps hearing children playing, but we haven't seen another hiker in days. Day 18. Found strange markings on trees, like handprints pressed into the bark. The local wildlife seems to avoid this area completely. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Day 23. Sarah disappeared during the night. Her sleeping bag is here. Still warm, but there's no sign of her. The others want to call for help, but our radios don't work anymore. Day 27. I think I saw Sarah today, high in the trees, but it couldn't have been her. The thing I saw had too many joints in its arms and legs. The final entry, written in shaking handwriting, is dated just 2 days ago. We were wrong. This isn't a forest. It's something that looks like a forest. Something hungry. If anyone finds this journal, don't look for us. Run. A branch snaps behind me. I spin around, clutching the journal, to find a woman standing at the edge of the clearing. She's wearing hiking clothes, but they're torn and stained with substances I don't want to identify. Her hair hangs in wet tangles around a face that would be pretty if not for the expression of absolute terror frozen in her features. Please help me, she whispers. I've been lost for so long. Every instinct tells me this is wrong. Her clothes are damaged but not weathered enough for someone who's been missing for weeks. Her skin is too pale, almost translucent in the dim light. And when she moves, she doesn't disturb the rain droplets falling around her. But she's human, or she was human once. And if there's any chance she's one of the missing hikers, I have to try. What's your name? I ask, keeping my distance. Sarah, she replies, and I realize this must be the woman mentioned in the journal. Sarah Chen, from the hiking group. We got separated and I've been looking for the others ever since. When did you get separated? Yesterday. Or maybe the day before. Time works differently here. She takes a step toward me and I notice that her feet don't quite touch the ground. She's hovering perhaps an inch above the forest floor, defying physics in the same casual way the upward falling rain ignores gravity. The others, I say carefully. Your hiking companions. Where did you see them last? Sarah's expression changes, becoming predatory. When she smiles, I see that her teeth have been filed to sharp points, and her mouth contains far too many of them. They're playing hide and seek, she says in that same child's voice I heard earlier. We're all playing hide and seek. Want to play with us? This time, I run. I crash through the underbrush without any attempt at stealth or navigation, driven by pure animal panic. Branches tear at my face and uniform while roots seem to shift position just in time to catch my boots. Behind me, I can hear Sarah, or the thing that was pretending to be Sarah, keeping pace effortlessly. Her laughter follows me like smoke, curling around trees and echoing from impossible directions. The forest has become a nightmare of shifting geometry. Paths that should lead uphill spiral downward instead. Trees that were 30 feet apart when I passed them the first time now grow so close together I have to turn sideways to squeeze between their trunks. And everywhere, carved into bark and pressed into mud, are those wrong-shaped handprints. I stumble into a small clearing and stop, gasping for breath. My lungs burn from the cold air and my legs shake from exhaustion. The laughter has stopped, but I can feel something watching me from the darkness between the trees. That's when I see them. They're standing in a perfect circle around the clearing's edge, barely visible in the perpetual twilight. At first glance, they might be human, the right height, the right general shape. But as my eyes adjust, the details become horrifyingly clear. The Michelson family, or what's left of them. The father stands to my left, his familiar face contorted into an expression of rapture that no human features should be able to achieve. His hiking clothes hang in tatters, revealing skin that seems to shift and flow like water. When he moves, I can see that his arms now bend in 3 places instead of 2. Next to him is his wife, her blonde hair now white as bone and moving in a wind I can't feel. Her eyes have been replaced by hollow sockets that somehow still manage to track my movement. She's holding hands with what might once have been their 12-year-old daughter, but the child's limbs have stretched and twisted until she resembles a broken marionette. The youngest, the 8-year-old boy, crouches on all fours at his mother's feet. His spine has sprouted additional vertebrae, creating a serpentine curve that allows his head to turn completely around to face me while his body remains motionless. We've been waiting for you, the father says, and his voice is like dry leaves scraping against stone. The game isn't fun without a ranger to play with. I back toward the center of the clearing, trying to keep all 4 of them in sight simultaneously. What happened to you? What is this place? The mother's hollow sockets seem to bore into my skull as she speaks. This is where the forest keeps its favorite things. People who get lost, people who wander off trails, people who don't listen to warnings about staying in groups. The forest fed us, adds the daughter, her voice high and sweet despite the grotesque angles of her extended joints. Fed us to itself, and now we're part of it forever. The little boy giggles, the sound emerging from a throat that has clearly been restructured. Want to see how it feels? Want to join our family? They begin moving toward me in perfect synchronization, their footsteps creating no sound on the forest floor. I fumble for my radio, even though I know it won't work, and my flashlight, even though its beam barely penetrates a few feet of the supernatural darkness. Stay back, I warn, pulling my service weapon. It feels pathetically inadequate against whatever these things have become. Bullets won't help, the father explains conversationally. We're not really here anymore. This is just how the forest remembers us, how it keeps us alive in its own way. The daughter nods enthusiastically, her neck bending at angles that make my stomach lurch. The forest needs us to find new players, new friends who won't ever leave. I fire 3 shots into the father's chest. The bullets pass through him without resistance, striking the trees behind with wet thudding sounds. He doesn't even pause in his approach. Your turn, he says, reaching out with arms that now stretch like rubber bands. Time to play. His fingers brush my shoulder, and the cold that floods through my body is beyond anything I've ever experienced. It's not just physical cold, it's the absence of life itself, the space between atoms, the silence that exists before the universe was born. I jerk away and run again, this time with a destination in mind. During my years patrolling this forest, I've memorized the location of every emergency shelter, every fire tower, every structure built by the Forest Service. There's a supply cache about half a mile north of here. If the forest hasn't moved it, if North still exists in this twisted version of reality. The Michelson family follows, but they don't run. They glide between the trees like echoes of motion, appearing ahead of me, behind me, above me in the branches. Always just at the edge of my vision, always just close enough for me to hear their whispered comments about the game they're playing. He's fast, the mother observes. But not fast enough, the father replies. They never are, adds the daughter with another giggle that makes my teeth ache. The little boy says nothing, but I can hear him moving through the underbrush parallel to my path, keeping pace on all fours. The supply cache is supposed to be in a reinforced concrete bunker built during World War II, when the government feared Japanese invasion of the Pacific Northwest. But when I reach the coordinates, I find instead a massive tree stump easily 20 feet across. The wood is black with age and streaked with the same red sap I saw earlier. Carved into the surface of the stump are dozens of handprints, not just the Michelson family, but many others. Different sizes, different ages, creating a palimpsest of everyone who has been taken by this place. Some of the prints are so old they've begun to fade, while others still glisten with fresh sap. In the center of the stump, like the hub of a wheel, is an opening. A perfect circle leading down into darkness, with carved steps spiraling into the earth. The red sap flows continuously down these steps, creating a vertical river that disappears into depths my flashlight can't penetrate. Found it, calls the daughter from behind me. He found the entrance. The rest of the family materializes around the stump, forming their circle again. But now they look different, more solid, more present. The closer they get to this place, the more real they become. Every forest has a heart, the father explains, gesturing toward the opening. A place where it keeps the things it values most. We live down there now, in the warm places between the roots. It's beautiful, the mother adds, her hollow eye sockets somehow conveying enthusiasm. No more hiking, no more camping in the rain, no more worrying about getting lost. We're exactly where we belong. The little boy finally speaks, his restructured throat producing sounds that barely qualify as language. Come play with us. Come be family. They close in, and I realize I have 2 choices. I can let them take me. Let whatever changed them change me too, become another handprint on this ancient stump, or I can take my chances with the vertical tunnel and whatever waits in the darkness below. The forest holds its breath. As I make my decision, I jump. The carved steps are slick with sap, and I lose my footing immediately. My flashlight flies from my hand as I tumble down the spiraling passage, bouncing off stone walls that feel organic rather than carved. The red sap coats my skin and clothes, warm and sticky like fresh blood. Above me, I can hear the Michelson family calling down into the tunnel, their voices full of excitement and anticipation. He's coming to visit. He's coming home. He's going to love it here. I fall for what feels like hours, though it can't be more than minutes. When I finally hit bottom, the impact drives all the air from my lungs and sends stars exploding across my vision. For several seconds I lie gasping in complete darkness, my body a symphony of bruises and scrapes. Then I hear breathing that isn't my own. My flashlight lies a few feet away, its beam creating a narrow cone of visibility in the absolute black. I crawl toward it, ignoring the protests from my battered muscles, and play the light around my surroundings. I'm in a vast underground chamber, carved from living rock. The walls curve upward beyond the reach of my flashlight, creating a cathedral-like space that echoes with every sound. But it's not empty. They hang from the ceiling like bats, dozens of them. People who entered the forest and never left, suspended upside down by what look like root systems that have grown through their bodies. Some still move slightly, turning their heads to track my light. Others have been here so long they've begun to merge with the organic cables that hold them. And at the center of the chamber, pulsing with a soft red glow that matches the sap, is the heart of the forest itself. It's massive, easily the size of a small building. The surface is covered in what might be bark, but bark that beats with a steady rhythm. Countless root systems extend from its base, disappearing into the stone walls and presumably stretching throughout the forest above. Some of the roots support the hanging bodies. Others disappear into holes that tunnel deeper underground. A few wrap around structures that look almost like altars, where offerings have been placed. Backpacks, hiking boots, personal belongings from decades of missing persons. The heart notices my presence. The beating increases and the red glow brightens until I can see clearly throughout the chamber. That's when I realize that some of the hanging figures are still alive, still aware. Their eyes track my movement, and their mouths move in silent screams or pleas. "Welcome," says a voice from directly behind me. I spin around to find a park ranger, or something wearing a ranger's uniform. The name tag reads Thompson, and I remember him from the personnel files. He disappeared 7 years ago while investigating reports of unusual wildlife behavior, but like the Michelson family, he's been changed. His limbs are too long, his face too wide, and when he smiles, I can see that his teeth have been replaced by something resembling thorns. "You're just in time for feeding," he says. The heart gets hungry when new visitors arrive. More figures emerge from the shadows around the chamber's edge. Rangers, hikers, campers, all of them missing persons from years past. All of them transformed into something that serves the forest's appetite. "We've been watching you," Thompson continues, "waiting for the right time to invite you down. The heart has been excited about meeting you specifically." "Why me?" "Rangers taste different. We understand the forest, we respect it, we love it even when it terrifies us. That makes us special ingredients." The heart's pulse accelerates, and I can feel something responding in my own chest. My blood begins to move in rhythm with that massive organ, as if it's already claiming me as part of itself. "Don't fight it," advises Thompson. "Fighting just makes the transformation more painful. Let the forest in, let it show you what you can become." Root tendrils begin emerging from the stone floor around my feet, seeking my ankles with blind persistence. The red sap flows more quickly now, pooling around my boots and beginning to climb up my legs. The hanging figures watch with expressions of anticipation, as if they're waiting for a show to begin. And somewhere far above, I can hear the Michelson family still calling down the tunnel, still excited that they've brought the forest a new toy. The roots reach my knees. The sap reaches my waist. The heart beats faster and faster, and my own pulse struggles to keep up. In desperation, I remember something from my survival training. Something about forest fires and how they spread, about the vulnerable points in any biological system. If this thing is truly the heart of the forest, if it's the source of all the supernatural phenomena I've encountered, then maybe I pull out my emergency flare, the bright red cylinder that's supposed to signal rescue aircraft in dire situations. But instead of pointing it toward the ceiling, I aim it directly at the massive, beating heart. "No," Thompson says, but his voice lacks the authority it held moments before. "You don't understand what you're doing. The forest needs its heart. We all need it." I pull the flare's ignition cord. Brilliant red light floods the chamber as the flare burns at 3,000 degrees. The heart's glow dims in comparison, and for the first time since I entered this nightmare, I hear the forest scream, not with voices, but with a sound that bypasses the ears and strikes directly at the nervous system. The hanging figures convulse in their root cradles. Thompson doubles over as if in physical pain, and cracks begin appearing in the stone walls of the chamber. The flare burns for only 30 seconds, but it's enough to show me what I need to see. The heart isn't just one organism, it's a complex network of smaller hearts connected by the root system, but each one vulnerable if attacked individually. As the flare gutters out, I make a promise to myself and to every person who has disappeared in this forest. I'm going to kill this thing, even if it costs me my life. The game has changed. The darkness that follows the flare's death is absolute. But something fundamental has shifted in the chamber. The steady pulse of the heart has become erratic, skipping beats and speeding up unpredictably. More importantly, the root tendrils that were climbing my legs have recoiled, pulling back into the stone floor as if burned. Thompson's voice comes out of the blackness, but it no longer carries the confidence of a predator toying with prey. You have no idea what you've done. The forest extends for hundreds of miles in every direction. Even if you damage the heart, there are others. Backups, redundancies. I fumble for my backup flashlight, smaller and weaker than the one I lost in the fall, but sufficient to navigate the chamber. Its beam reveals that Thompson has backed away from me, joining the other transformed figures at the chamber's edge. They're all watching the heart with expressions of concern rather than anticipation. Maybe, I reply, checking my equipment. But this is clearly the primary hub, otherwise you wouldn't have brought me here. The heart's irregular beating is affecting the entire chamber. Chunks of stone fall from the ceiling, and the red sap flow has become sporadic, sometimes stopping entirely before resuming in violent spurts. Several of the hanging figures have begun to stir more actively, as if whatever force was keeping them docile has weakened. I have 2 more emergency flares, a handful of waterproof matches, and about half a bottle of camp fuel in my pack. Not much to work with, but forest fires have destroyed larger things than this underground ecosystem. The forest gave us immortality, Thompson continues, his transformed features making him difficult to read in the dim light. We'll live forever as part of something greater than ourselves. You're trying to murder dozens of people who found peace here. This isn't peace, I say, gesturing toward the hanging figures. This is parasitism. The forest is keeping you alive as food sources, not as treasured residents. To prove my point, I aim my flashlight at the nearest suspended figure. It's a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing the remnants of hiking gear from at least a decade ago. Roots have grown through her body, entering at various points and emerging at others, creating a living web that supports her weight. But her eyes are aware, tracking my light, and her mouth moves in what might be an attempt at speech. I step closer, trying to understand what she's saying. Her voice is barely a whisper, distorted by the root system that has grown through her throat, but the word she's repeating becomes clear. Kill me, kill me. Thompson and the other transformed figures shift uncomfortably. She doesn't mean that, he says quickly. The integration process causes temporary disorientation. Once it's complete, she'll understand how wonderful this is. How long has she been hanging there? Time isn't. It doesn't work the same way down here. I check the woman's clothing and equipment, looking for anything that might identify when she disappeared. Her hiking boots are a style that was popular in the early 2000s, and her backpack is a model I remember from outdoors magazines from around the same time period. 20 years, I say. She's been suspended here for 20 years, and you call that temporary disorientation? The heart's erratic pulse accelerates further, and I realize that our conversation is agitating it. Perhaps because I'm forcing its servants to confront truths they've been avoiding, or perhaps because I'm still carrying lit fire in the form of my remaining flares. I need to move quickly before Thompson and the others decide I'm too dangerous to leave alive. The chamber has 3 main sections: the central area where the heart dominates, the walls where the transformed figures lurk, and the ceiling where the victims hang like grotesque fruit. If I'm going to destroy this system, I need to target the connections, the root networks that tie everything together. My first flare revealed that the heart is actually multiple organs working in concert. The second flare needs to be more strategic, aimed at a point where multiple root systems converge. I circle the heart, looking for structural weaknesses while Thompson and his companions shadow my movements. The massive organ is surrounded by root bundles that disappear into the stone in dozens of places, but there's one area where 6 major bundles merge before entering the wall. If I can sever that connection— Stop, Thompson says, and this time there's genuine fear in his voice. If you damage the root network, the hanging ones will die. All of them. They're already dead. You've just been keeping their bodies alive to feed this thing. I light my second flare, and the chamber fills with brilliant red light once more. This time, I don't aim for the heart itself, but for the convergence point of the root bundles. The flare burns through organic matter like a blowtorch through butter. The roots convulse and writhe as they're severed, spraying luminescent sap that hisses where it hits the stone floor. The heart's pulse becomes wildly erratic, and several of the hanging figures begin to convulse more violently. But something else happens too. The transformed figures at the chamber's edge begin to change again, their elongated limbs shortening, their facial features becoming more human. Whatever connection they had to the forest's power is weakening. Thompson staggers, his thorn teeth falling out and being replaced by normal human dental work. What's happening to us? You're becoming human again, I tell him. The question is whether you can remember how. The severed root bundles are hemorrhaging sap, and the pool of luminescent fluid around the heart's base is growing rapidly. More chunks of stone fall from the ceiling, and several of the hanging figures have gone completely limp. I check on the woman who is pleading for death. Her eyes have closed, but she's breathing regularly for the first time since I arrived. The roots that were growing through her body are withdrawing, leaving behind wounds that are already beginning to heal with unnatural speed. The forest's power is failing, but it's not dead yet. My last flare needs to count. I study the heart itself, looking for what might be its most vulnerable point. The surface is covered in what looks like bark, but bark that shifts and moves with each beat. In several places, the covering has split to reveal pulsing organic matter underneath. One split is larger than the others, a gap perhaps 6 inches wide that exposes what looks like a cluster of smaller hearts beating in complex rhythm. If I can get the flare inside that gap, Thompson and the other transformed figures are becoming more human by the minute, but they're also becoming more desperate. Please, Thompson begs. Even if you destroy this heart, there are others. The forest will just relocate its center somewhere else. You'll have accomplished nothing except murder. Then I'll find the others too, and I'll destroy every single one until there's nothing left but ordinary trees. I approach the heart, flare in hand, but the massive organ seems to sense my intent. The gap in its surface begins to close, and new root tendrils emerge from the floor around my feet. This time, I'm ready for them. I pour the camp fuel in a circle around my position and light it with one of my waterproof matches. The flames create a barrier that the roots can't cross, at least temporarily. The heart's pulse becomes frantic as I raise the final flare, but before I can ignite it, I hear something that makes me pause. Children's laughter. Not the twisted, impossible laughter I've been hearing throughout this nightmare, but genuine human children laughing and playing. I look up at the chamber ceiling and see them, the Michelson children, 8 and 12 years old, hanging upside down with roots growing through their small bodies. But unlike the adult victims, they're awake and aware, and they're laughing because they can see me. They think I'm here to rescue them. Mister, the 8-year-old calls out, his voice weak but hopeful. Are you here to take us home? The 12-year-old girl tries to wave, though the roots limit her movement. We've been waiting for someone to find us. Our mom and dad are here too, but they're different now. I realize that what I saw in the forest above, the transformed Michelson family, were decoys, puppets created by the forest to lure me into this trap. The real family is here, suspended like all the others, kept alive as food sources for the heart. Thompson sees my hesitation and presses his advantage. You see, they're alive, all of them. If you destroy the heart, you'll be killing dozens of innocent people, including children. The camp fuel barrier won't last much longer, and the heart is already beginning to adapt, sending root tendrils over and under the flames rather than through them. I have seconds to decide. Save the victims and let the forest continue claiming new prey, or destroy the heart and accept that everyone currently suspended will die with it. The 8-year-old's voice cuts through my moral paralysis. Mister, are we going to die down here? I look up at him. This child who should be starting 3rd grade instead of hanging in an underground chamber serving as food for an ancient forest spirit. No, I tell him. You're going home. I light the final flare and drive it deep into the heart's exposed gap before anyone can stop me. The heart's death scream isn't a sound, it's a seismic event that shakes the entire chamber and travels upward through miles of root system into the forest above. Stone rains from the ceiling as the massive organ convulses, its luminescent sap spraying in geyser-like eruptions that paint the walls with dying light. The hanging figures drop all at once as the root systems that held them wither and snap. I rush from one to another, checking for signs of life, dreading what I'll find but unable to stop myself from looking. Miraculously, impossibly, most of them are breathing. The forest's parasitic relationship kept their bodies alive even as it fed on their life force. Without that connection, they're unconscious but stable, their wounds healing with supernatural speed as the last of the forest's power flees their systems. Thompson and the other transformed figures have become fully human again, though they seem confused and disoriented by the change. I remember now, Thompson says, staring at his normal-sized hands in wonder. I remember being a ranger, investigating missing persons reports. How long have I been down here? 7 years, according to your disappearance file. He looks around the chamber, taking in the dozens of bodies scattered across the floor, the dying heart at the center, the crumbling stone walls. 7 years of being something else. 7 years of helping this thing hunt people. The guilt in his voice is overwhelming, but there's no time for therapy sessions. The chamber is collapsing, and we need to evacuate nearly 30 unconscious victims through a vertical tunnel that barely accommodated one person. The entrance, I asked Thompson. Is there another way out? He points to a section of wall where several large root bundles disappeared into the stone. There are maintenance passages that lead to other parts of the forest, but they're small, barely big enough to crawl through. Show me. Working together, we locate a passage that might lead upward. It's a natural cave system that the forest's root network had been using as a highway, but with the heart dead, the organic matter is already beginning to decompose and clear the way. The next several hours, or it might be days, time still behaves strangely in this place, are a nightmare of logistics and endurance. We work in teams, carrying unconscious victims through narrow passages that sometimes open into larger chambers and sometimes force us to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for a human body. Thompson remembers more of his human personality as we work. He tells me about the others who were transformed, how they retained just enough consciousness to feel guilty about every person they helped the forest capture. The weight of that knowledge has been driving several of them toward complete madness. We could have fought it, he says as we carry the Michelson parents through a particularly narrow section. At first, when the change was just beginning, we could have resisted. But it felt so good to let go, to become part of something larger. By the time we realized what we'd lost, it was too late. The real Michelson children are among the survivors, though they sleep so deeply they seem more dead than alive. Their parents too, and the woman who was begging me to kill her, and hikers who disappeared decades ago but whose bodies remain perfectly preserved. Some we lose. The oldest victims, people who had been suspended for more than 20 years, don't survive the separation from the forest's power. Their bodies simply stop functioning once the unnatural life support is removed. We carry them anyway, because even death deserves dignity. The maintenance passages eventually lead us to a cave opening about 2 miles from where I originally entered the forest. When we emerge, blinking in genuine daylight, the world above has changed as dramatically as the world below. The forest is dying, not just sick or damaged, but actively decomposing. Trees that stood for centuries are collapsing into piles of ordinary rot. The supernatural mist has lifted, revealing vast stretches of dead and dying vegetation. The unnatural silence has been replaced by the sound of settling wood and falling branches. My radio crackles to life, finally able to receive signals now that the forest's interference has ended. Dispatch's voice comes through clearly. Any unit, we have multiple reports of seismic activity in the Olympic forest. Hikers are reporting that large sections of forest appear to be dying or dead. Please respond. This is Range Station 7, I reply, my voice hoarse from exertion and smoke. I'm at coordinates. I check my GPS, which now works perfectly. I have approximately 28 rescued individuals, all requiring immediate medical attention. Multiple units and medical helicopters needed immediately. The response is chaos. Overlapping voices as every available unit tries to respond at once. Within an hour, the area is swarming with emergency personnel, medical helicopters, and what appears to be half the television news crews in Washington state. The survivors are evacuated first, though explaining their condition proves challenging. How do you tell a doctor that someone has been kept alive for 15 years by being fed to a supernatural forest heart? The medical teams adapt quickly, focusing on treatment rather than explanation. Thompson and the other transformed rangers present a different problem. They're technically missing persons, presumed dead, with families who have grieved and moved on. Reintegrating them into society will require careful psychological evaluation and extensive support. The Michelson family recovers quickly once they reach the hospital. The children remember their ordeal as a strange dream, which the psychiatrists assure me is a common protective mechanism. Their parents retain more detailed memories but seem determined to focus on their survival rather than their trauma. Within a week, the story becomes a media sensation. Miracle rescue in Olympic Forest dominates news cycles, though the official explanation focuses on a previously unknown cave system where the victims had been trapped by rockfalls. The supernatural elements are classified and filed away in government databases that will probably never see public scrutiny. I return to my ranger station to find it exactly as I left it. Though the forest around it has been transformed into something ordinary, No more shifting paths or impossible geometry. No more handprints carved into bark or red sap bleeding from wounded trees. Just normal woods where normal people can hike normal trails without fear of becoming food for something ancient and hungry. But I keep the slashes I carved in my window frame, counting each gray dawn. 43 days of rain, followed by the day everything changed. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear children laughing in the distance. But when I investigate, I find only normal sounds: night birds, small animals, the wind through ordinary branches. The forest department offers me a transfer, a promotion, anything to get me away from the area that nearly cost me my sanity. I decline. Someone needs to watch this place, to make sure the heart doesn't regenerate, to ensure that the passages we found remain clear and mapped. Thompson takes a medical retirement and moves to Arizona, as far from deep forest as he can get. But he calls occasionally, usually late at night, to ask if I've seen anything unusual, any signs that what we killed might be growing back. So far, the answer is no. The Olympic forest remains ordinary, beautiful in the way that normal forests are beautiful, dangerous only in the ways that normal wilderness is dangerous. But I keep my flares ready and I maintain detailed maps of every cave system in my sector, because forests are patient and the things that live in forests are patient too. And sometimes, when the rain hasn't stopped in weeks and the mist hangs thick between the trees, I remember that we only destroyed one heart. Thompson mentioned there were others. I listen to my radio more carefully these days, paying attention to reports of missing hikers from forests across the Pacific Northwest. Most turn out to be routine search and rescue operations, but sometimes, not often, but sometimes the reports describe familiar patterns, experienced hikers who simply vanish without a trace, footprints that stop suddenly in the middle of trails, children's laughter heard from deep woods where no children should be playing. When those reports come in, I request temporary assignment to assist in the search efforts. It's always unofficial, always volunteer time, but the other rangers have learned not to ask too many questions about my methods or equipment. So far, I haven't found another heart. But I know they're out there, waiting in forests I haven't explored yet, feeding on people who venture too far from marked trails. The game isn't over. It's just moved to new playing fields, and I'll be ready for it. The rain stopped falling upward that day we destroyed the heart. But sometimes, when I'm patrolling the deepest parts of my territory, I see individual droplets hesitating on their way down, as if they remember a time when gravity worked differently. Those moments remind me that there are older rules than physics, deeper hungers than anything science can explain, and forests that were never meant to be safe for human visitors. I keep my flares ready, I keep my maps updated, and I keep listening for children's laughter that comes from all the wrong directions, because the forest remembers even when it pretends to forget. And somewhere, in woods I haven't found yet, another heart is beating.